Hey, can you hear me? Hold on one sec. Oh, you can? Okay, great. I'm a wizard. Oh yeah, one sec. Here is my camera. I think. Uh-oh, it's gonna work. I gotta quit OBS first. Oh no, I can, hold on. Yeah, I know how to fix this. Give me 30 seconds or so. Blah, blah, blah. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Got my video? Good. And I am streaming for the first time on YouTube. Just making sure that works.
I don't know if you're talking to me or the stream, but I cannot hear you. Nope, I can't hear you. To me or the stream, but I cannot hear you. Boy. Oh, nope, I can't hear you.
How about now?
You're back. I can see your logo.
Awesome.
I can hear you as well.
And now
to me or the stream.
Hopefully.
Oh, I cannot hear you. Boy.
It's like whack-a-mole. Hold on.
Oh, nope, I can't hear you.
How about now?
You're back. I can see your logo.
Awesome.
Yep, no worries. I can...
Sorry, one sec.
Multiple OBSs open.
But OBS and Discord. OBS can share the camera with Discord, but not the other way around. So I have to get the Discord video in Discord working before OBS takes the camera. And if I don't, then I have to turn the camera off in OBS and start the video in Discord and then turn it back on in OBS.
No, that's what I'm saying. You can have two OBSs and one of them can be a virtual cam and then the other one can be like another angle, and you can just pick which one does which.
Okay, we'll try that next time. Yeah. But anyway, we're all good. I'm streaming.
You could have like what I do when I'm on debates and I don't want like my chat to show. I have two OBSs. One of them is a virtual cam, and then another one's just doing the stream. And I'll use the virtual cam for my Discord.
Right.
And then the stream obviously just has like, it's just the stream camera or whatever you pick, right? So.
And the OBS is share the camera. Okay.
Well, yeah, one OBS would be dedicated to Discord. The other one would be dedicated to just streaming.
And they can both use the same camera. Like the OBSs don't lock each other out of the camera.
Yeah, you could do it with the same camera if you wanted.
Yeah, that's what I need to do.
Because you're not virtual camming when you're on OBS, right? The virtual cam is for Discord, right?
Right.
So it's only one of them would virtual cam, and it would only pick that one. That's what I did to do that. Oh my God, that's a loud cat.
He is a loud cat.
Well, are you ready to talk?
I am.
Last username.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I can't. You were in the chat during some discussion, I think, and you or me wanted to discuss anarcho-capitalism, and I don't really know if we talked about anything more in depth than that.
Right. Our last discussion, we talked about it, and we were mostly talking about sort of like paternalism type stuff, right? Talked about like the FDA a lot.
Okay.
Which is okay, although I was kind of more interested in talking to you about polycentric law, which I guess is sort of the more kind of out there part, or the more speculative part of anarcho-capitalism. I was kind of interested in, since it's an idea that's based on like economic arguments, or at least I base on economic arguments, I was curious to hear the thoughts of an economist on this idea. You know what I'm talking about?
Okay. Yeah, when you say polycentric law, I assume you're just talking about basically competing law systems, market for laws.
Right. So not having a single organization that controls the legal system within a particular territory. Multiple organizations enforcing justice, enforcing rights in the same territory. I think we have good reason to think that is feasible, and if it's feasible, then there are sort of straightforward benefits to it.
What are the good reasons to think that this is feasible?
Well, it's generally feasible to have, people offering services in the same region. And it doesn't seem like there's anything particular about rights enforcement that needs to be where you need a monopoly, territorial monopolies. Now, at first it may seem that way because you think, well, you need someone making all the rules for that area and enforcing the rules. And then based on those rules, you can have other sorts of trade and other sorts of markets, but you need like a justice system sort of bootstrap all of that, to bootstrap the market. But if you think about it a little bit, it doesn't actually seem to be the case. If you had multiple agencies providing, the way to start understanding this is to think about private security firms, which exist right now. You can hire private security, and think like, what if there was no justice system and you just hired a private security firm to enforce your rights? And then, okay, sure. So you hire them, and if someone violates your rights, you call them up and you ask them to do something about it. And of course, the obvious problem is like, well, what if they have a private security firm too, and it's a different firm, and when you try to enforce, enforce some punishment against them, or sue them or whatever. They call their rights enforcement and say, well, you're violating my rights, so I'm going to call my firm to defend me from your firm, and they're going to go to war or something like that. But actually, that's not really, there's no real reason to think that firms would do that, because rights enforcement firms they're not making money. I mean, for two security firms to go to do that, to go to war with each other, would be very, very expensive. And that's not the thing that they make money from, right? They make money from protecting people's rights and keeping them safe, not from fighting against other firms. So they have a very strong incentive to get along with other firms and find some way of cooperating with them. And I would imagine that works very similar to the way that different nations cooperate with each other and manage to have to settle legal disputes across their border without going to war with each other. Most of them do, like America and Canada. And the way they do that is they have an elaborate series of system of treaties. So they essentially have agreed on laws that they're both going to follow to some extent. And when there's a dispute, they have some treaty agreement in place that says how that dispute's resolved and what how it works across the border. I don't see any reason that you couldn't have that on a smaller scale with rights enforcement agencies.
Yeah, sure. I get the point, I guess. I think that I think one critique that I would have is that I think that treaties are arguably a little bit different because they're, I don't want to say less nuanced, but I mean, there's not a treaty on like, how to manage like trash collection in a specific neighborhood, right? I mean, the treaties are a little bit more macro intensive with collective buy-in amongst each company or amongst each country group. Now, in your world, there would be, in theory, just this on a smaller scale, right? You'd have like the rights enforcement customers collective buy-in to those rights in a dispute against the collective buy-in of another rights enforcement agency of another group. So I understand that. I think that we would end up with, in my view, probably a lot of inefficiency, because insofar as we can glean efficiency from having a singular set of laws that we tend to agree on, this would be opposite that, trading off some more fitted sets of laws that you might choose to follow. Now, obviously, some people might say, oh, well, what if there's a rights enforcement agency that makes, rape legal or something like that? And I know the arguments against that. I'm not sure those arguments don't resonate with me as much. The second point that I would make on the idea that rights enforcement agencies wouldn't go to war because, number one, that's not their job, and number two, it's very costly to go to war. Violence is costly, I suppose, right? Most people would prefer to just work a regular job. Most people don't want to rob anyone's house, right? Probably, if we're willing to admit, at least in part because it's hard to rob houses, right? And if it was easier, more people might do it. But I think that this is wrong, though, because at the end of the day, right, whether it's between states or between rights enforcement agencies, wars and colonialism do happen, right? And they happen for a set of reasons, depending on which school of international thought you believe in, I guess. Maybe a composite of the three main ones. But it does happen, and I just think that devolving that authority down to basically anyone who can start a rights enforcement agency or any rights enforcement agency with a group of people would almost necessarily lead to more violence, because we're talking about, adding in all of those complications of legal arbitration to a geographically non-distinct group of people. I might use maybe a softer example to war. For instance, say that, say two rights enforcement agencies disagreed on how fast to allow drivers to drive, right? Now, I can see how you could arbitrate this, but in the meantime, you have, in theory, the same highway, but with many different people, we call it the same highway, but instead with many different people driving different speeds on it. And I think that in the short term, that's just a really tough system to sell to me personally.
Well, I assume that the highway, whoever owned the highway would decide the speeds, right, on there to drive on their highway. You need. I don't think
But
you need
why?
rights. What do you mean? Well, because it's their highway,
Well, but it's my right to drive however fast I want in my car, right?
not on someone else's highway.
Well, I think that kind of brings up a different question, right? Because if you have ultimate authority, I assume you wouldn't say you have ultimate authority over your own property, even in an anarcho-capitalist system, right? So, like,
Well, perhaps not, but
when it
you'd
comes,
definitely have the authority to decide how fast people drive on it. That seems like a fairly.
I don't.
That doesn't strike me as like a hard thing to dispute. Like it's pretty. It's pretty clear that it seems clear to me that whoever owns the highway has the right to decide who drives on it and how fast they drive,
Right.
and various other things, whether they're drunk or not.
Well,
And
so
I don't think it doesn't seem like a rights enforcement agency would have trouble coming to like a consensus on that. You know, it seems like a rights
so
like
someone.
I can't see a rights enforcement agency
question would
like
be-
offering the right to drive on someone else's highway against their rules. That seems like it would.
Well, Well, no, I mean, I don't think it's the most unreasonable thing to assume that communities would come together and say we want to have a standard sort of agreement in terms of vehicle safety, which might include a speed limit on all roads built, right? I think that's even in an anarcho-capitalist world, that's certainly a more collective responsibility, and I think that does, pose
Why is that
a very
collective?
granular. Well, I'm not saying it has to be in an anarcho-capitalist world, but what I am saying is that I think most communities in an anarcho-capitalist world would probably come up with some geographic statutes on that poor cat. Poor kitty.
It's just got the
Um,
zoomies.
would come up with some collective statutes saying hey, we're going to have these you know whatever, like our community wants these specific requirements in terms of vehicle safety and code and whatnot, and I don't think that'd be the most unreasonable thing just to put that burden on the highway manufacturer. Say, hey, if you want to build a highway here, understand these are the circumstances in which you can build it. But if it's the opposite and you're saying that that decision would just be made by the person who builds the highway, now all of a sudden you're saying that if you want to build a highway and charge a toll for it, which I think most roads in an anarcho-capitalist world, at least by highway builders, would have tolls. They'd almost have to. Not only do you have to charge a toll for it, you have to basically fund your own police force to enforce traffic laws for them, which makes it a little bit more expensive.
Just hire security for your highway.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You have to fund basically a police force to enforce your own individual highways traffic laws, but then that adds a whole layer of
basically the highway
complexity.
patrol.
Well, yeah, but at this point in our, I don't want to oversimplify, but in our current sort of unified code of law, right? Obviously, there's devolved authority, ordinances and state laws and stuff like that. That's true. But, when we're talking about driving on highways as an interesting example, I don't really like all the laws are basically the same across states. Now I get it. There's little nuanced changes here and there, but there's a speed limit. It's some number. There's signs for it, right? Hey, drive on the right side of the road. Hey, wear a seatbelt. There's laws that are pretty universal in every country when it comes to highway driving. But
sure,
the problem
so let me jump in.
Yeah,
so you're going all over the place here. The reason there's uniformity in those laws is not because
we've only been talking about highways last username. It's not all over the place. It was all about highways.
I remember a few other things back there, but so the reason there is there doesn't necessarily have to be uniformity. You could imagine different municipalities and states or whatever having completely different traffic laws, but they obviously don't because that would be a pain in the butt. So there's an incentive for them to make the laws uniform, and there's the same incentive in a market for if you have different providers of roads to make those laws uniform, because if they're not, then people are not going to know what rules to follow, and they're going to break those rules, and they'll have to pay more for security, and there'll be more accidents, and like the same. There's no particular reason to think that there'd be any less uniformity in a market for roads than in state controlled roads, especially considering the roads are controlled at a fairly local level already. So.
No, I don't think I agree, because I think that we're assuming a couple things, right? Which is that I think the biggest thing we're assuming here is that the market for new roads is going to be relatively competitive, right? Which it almost necessarily won't be.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not relatively competitive, what that kind of means is that you end up with a lot of people with control to certain roads in certain areas that are certainly more prime than others. Now, what that means is that, well, because we live in a world where I would say that the demand for nobody really thinks about the demand for roads because it's basically a government funded service, but the demand for roads in a private market is fairly inelastic, right? And so, if you have access to like a certain critical piece of infrastructure that because of geographic reasons you can't necessarily obfuscate very well, I think you end up being able to take advantage of a lot of consumers along the way. And I think that in general, that's kind of my main criticism of anarcho-capitalism in the first place.
How did it get to be a critical piece of infrastructure, though?
First, thanks Drizzle Drain for donating $2. Now you asked the question, how did it get to be a critical piece of infrastructure? Well, I mean, it could just be that you ended up, let's say that you were the first one to build a road in a specific densely populated area.
Well, how would it be densely populated if no one's built new roads into it?
Well, how did we have densely populated cities before we had roads?
We didn't. I mean, we built roads. You got a road somewhere before it becomes densely populated. People have to want to move there.
I think it depends on what you mean by road. I mean, obviously we didn't have robust highway infrastructure for thousands of years, but we still had densely populated areas, right?
Well, because we didn't have anything to go on the roads. But now, if you want to start a new area, a new town or whatever, it's not going to be densely populated until there are roads there.
Yeah, if we're talking about in a modern context, right? That's kind of what I'm saying though, is that we have to we work within a modern context. That's true, right? But at the same time, though, when we're thinking about all the different, that was kind of the last point that I was going to make. If we think about all the different sort of market failures that are associated with all the different markets, right? Anarcho-capitalism offers not, to me, the cleanest way to solve those problems. Like we talk about the market for highways, right? This is not a perfectly competitive market structurally. Like it is a market that structurally requires external regulation. Now, I think from the ANCAP perspective,
so it's not perfectly competitive. I mean, you could say there's externalities or lock-in or whatever, but there's lots of other markets like that as well. I mean, right now, my computer is a Mac. Some of my viewers are watching the stream on PCs. Somehow those computers are talking to each other, even though they're made by companies that are not the same company and don't even like each other that much. Somehow, there's like all these extremely complicated and elaborate standards that allow many, competitive computer products to talk to each other. And that all came about without any regulation. The government didn't need to step in and say, this is how USB works, this is how this protocol works. Like it was all just nearly all of it was just come up by standards committees started by these companies because they realized that it was more valuable to all of them to cooperate and for their things to work together than it is to not work together. So if that can happen with computers, I don't see why it couldn't happen with roads.
Well, because we're not necessarily talking about like because I think with computers and with other things, right? Like different, whatever we talk about, like outlets. Why are all the outlets the same? I think that the reason that we tend to use like Phillips head and flathead screws was because of I think that was one of the things that the Hoover administration actually did was standardize the sort of bolts that we use. Obviously there's difference. There's more than just the Phillips head and the flathead, but obviously that was kind of the main ones that we use. And then we see different regulations in that regard. Like the EU apparently is going to require the Apple products to use basically USB instead of their, the Lightning port or whatever, because at least from the EU's perspective, it seems like they're viewing the Lightning port as basically just a way to upcharge for products. So they're standardizing those things. And I think that's a form of standardization that can be good on a government level. I think that
they're only now getting into standardizing. For some reason, they think that now we need that regulation, even though the entire we've gotten as far as we have without any kind of regulation about what ports people have to use.
I get that. I mean, obviously, I don't think that I don't think the society was like falling apart at the seams because you had to use a Lightning port versus a USB cable. I mean, it's obviously not the most consequential piece of legislation, but it is but one example of how the government enforcing some standardization on a market can have net utility to the consumer, right?
Well, how is that an example? Like, first of all, they haven't even done it yet, and why are you assuming that this is somehow going to make things better Even though when we have lots of empirical data that without these regulations, things have become much more standardized and uniform and interoperable over the entire history of computing with nearly zero regulation. So why are we now saying, how are you using this example of something the government wants to do as an example of why they should do it?
Because right now, a lot of people buy Apple products, and Apple has obviously exclusive license to build those products how they want, at least presently, let's say, minus some whatever safety regulations there might be or whatever it is. And they have the Lightning port, quote unquote, which they feel is the best port for their phones. However, it seems like what the EU has decided, and what I think many consumers will be happy with when it eventually gets implemented, if it eventually gets implemented, to your point, is the fact that if they were to lose their charger, right, instead of having to only buy from one single company, they could now buy from what is a plethora of companies producing the same standardized charger.
You can already do that.
This is an example.
You don't have to buy Apple chargers to you can buy like non-Apple chargers to charge Apple stuff.
Well, you don't have to buy directly from Apple. It has to be the same like technology, though, right? It's the same, Lightning port. It has to be compatible with the device, obviously. So I'm saying is that if we had rather one piece of technology that was compatible with all the different sort of iPhones, right? The different charging. This is an example where I think that this provides utility because it increases, at least to some extent, the options for more affordable charging mechanisms for those phones, right? Now, at the end of the day, I think you could say that, well, if you're that unhappy with the different charging, charging devices, if you're that unhappy with the lack of optionality there, you could always buy, a Samsung or a Google phone or Pixel, whatever.
Do you remember when every phone had its own charging port? That used to be the case. It used to be like literally every phone had a proprietary jack, and you could only buy chargers for phones from that one phone from that one manufacturer. With zero regulation, with zero government intervention, we got from there to basically having just two ports, one for Apple and one for all the others. That seems like pretty good progress in a very short time, less than a decade or something, with no help from the government. And now you're arguing that somehow you think that the government stepping into that and regulating it is necessary or even going to be beneficial. Why?
No, I'm not arguing that government regulation always makes things better, right? It seems like I think we would both agree. Well, how do I put this? We wouldn't agree, I think, on the implication, but we would agree on the more narrow statement, which is that sometimes deregulating something is fine, and also sometimes markets will regulate themselves in terms of adopting industry standards. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable, right?
Right.
All that I'm saying is that in absence of the market doing that holistically, right, it's fine for the government to step in and say, hey, this is now a standard.
I'm using the phones as an example of the market doing it. Right? That's a point for me.
I don't think phones. No, I don't think it is though, because I don't think phones are
quite
as standardized as your.
Empirically, they're much more standardized than they used to be. It seems like there's very obvious progress.
I honestly, I don't know how old you are, to be fair.
43.
At least in my history of using phones, using, a combination of flip phones and different, BlackBerry style phones before the iPhones came about, sort of touchscreen revolution that we had in the, late 2010s or the late 2000s. Outside of that, personally, I don't recall there being like a huge difference in the ability to charge your phone between different chargers. I think it was actually the opposite. But
when has it ever been better than now?
Further back. Well, I just recall that what's the people in the chat are probably going to know. There's a specific device, there's a specific cable that's used to charge like Bluetooth headphones, right? And I think that's the cable in similar fashion that used to be able to charge most phones. Now, my point is not, again, we have to
wait. It can't. Apple is always up until Lightning.
You're asking me to remember when I was like 7 and had a phone. The point is, I just remember being able to use different chargers for different phones. Like you were saying, like every phone had its own unique.
Yeah, that's bad. You're saying. I'm arguing that there used to be far more chargers that were not compatible with each other, and now we only basically have 2 kinds of chargers. That's progress.
What I'm saying is that I'll give you that one. I'm honestly not sure, right? I'm just saying that when I was a kid, I had different chargers that could charge different phones. Like I'm not sure if it was as
What do you mean
little
different
sort of
chargers that could
cross
charge different
compatibility.
phones? Of course, that's the proprietary chargers, right? They could only
No,
each
okay,
charger can
I'm
only
sorry.
charge one phone.
I might be phrasing it poorly. When I say different chargers, I mean that there was a diversity of chargers in terms of not technology, but in terms of who made them that could charge a diversity of phones. It was a little bit, I think, more standardized than you're leading on, to be fair.
When
To be fair, also,
what was the standard? When was this ever more standardized? I don't like there was I don't
no, God, okay, Jesus. We're getting a little hung up on here. The point is just to say that I can't remember, the exact fucking, specs of the phones that I had when I was 7 and 8 years old. The point is just to say that
I do.
I remember that certainly there were. You remember the phone you had when you were 7? I mean, I don't know.
There were no phones
You
when
know,
I was
not,
7. No cell
yeah,
phones.
not to insult you or
But
anything. I'm not
I
sure
remember.
if they had
I've been
cell
alive
phones
for the
back then.
entire history of cell phones. I remember it all. So, and I'm telling
Yeah,
you,
sure. I'm sure you as an adult you probably remember it
there's
better
been
than
a
I do.
very
The point
steady
is just to say,
improvement in standardization from the
I
beginning to
agree.
now.
I'm not saying there hasn't been. All I'm saying is that the government, I think, reasonably has a role in saying, hey, if we want more standardization that certain actors in the market are unwilling to comply with, we can regulate that.
Okay,
Because
why?
apparently this has been a negotiation. Yeah, so because again, to me, I think that provides some net utility in certain circumstances in terms of enforcing standardization. In the case of Apple, obviously being one of the biggest phone manufacturers in the world, they might be, I assume they're the biggest $1 trillion company. Um, they've been unwilling for obviously all throughout their history to adopt a USB charger. And the government, the EU, regulatory agencies are saying, hey, I know that you've been unwilling to do this, but hey, in this concentrated market, you basically aren't allowed to do that anymore. You have to adopt a USB charger for your devices. I don't think that's the worst thing in the world because the market's unwilling to do that. We've got
Why
a
is it a good?
concentrated market where one actor isn't willing to do that.
So what? Like why? I don't understand why. First of all, are you sure that their choice of their port is not doesn't have some practical benefit over USB-C? Second of all, why? I mean, yeah, Apple's been basically the last holdout in this move towards standardization. It used to be everyone was a holdout, and now everyone except Apple has agreed to standardize, and now you've got one more company. So why do you think that we need intervention to force this one last company to standardize? And why is it so important that they standardize? I mean, lots of people buy Apple phones despite them not working with USB-C chargers. Is there? I don't see that there's some huge problem here that justifies government intervention. Because the problem is when the government gets in and says, well, now you have to use this port. Well, what happens? Also notice that we're also getting new ports all the time and getting rid of old ones. And this is for good reason, right? Because there's technological improvements that are going into these ports. So once you standardize, once the government comes in and regulates it, now to make a new, to improve on a port, you can't just improve on it and release a new product and hope that people buy it. You also have to get some sort of special permission or lobby the government to change the law to allow you to innovate in this technology. This is why the government's been staying out of it. And this is a well-known problem with government regulation of technology. So why do you think that risking that is so obviously worth forcing the benefits of forcing Apple to adopt USB-C when there's every reason to think that they'll probably adopt it eventually anyway, considering, based on empirical history?
I don't think there's every reason to assume that they'll
That's
adopt it anyway.
the historical trend, right? Empirics are on my side here.
The historical trend, as Fabian Liberty would say, doesn't actually establish necessarily a fact of the matter, right? So just because you can point to a historical trend, it doesn't mean that current present-day context, the leaders of Apple are tied or able to be predicted off of that historical trend. Obviously, there's unique risk and unique.
But in absence of any other evidence, we tend to.
I've got to finish here. So
okay.
Let me just finish my point here. So the point is that I don't think that is a great argument because obviously today we certainly have a far different market for telecommunications than we had, 40 years ago, let's say, right? In the whatever starting point you would establish for contemporary telecommunications. I don't know what fair point that would be. But the point is just to say that in this regard, right, I fully recognize that markets can sometimes lead to standardization on their own. Not saying they can't. All that I'm saying that is in this regard, at least from what I was able to read, this leads to consumers saving a ton of money. In regards to your innovation point, I don't think necessarily having different standardization has led to like less innovation, right? When we think about, say, outlets in walls, right? I don't know I don't know if that's a strict government regulation or if it's just a building code standard adopted across, pretty much every municipality, or how that works. Maybe it's just completely the market just prefers, the standard 2-slot, 2 or 3-slot, not USB outlet like in America. But I don't think that that restriction in building has led to less innovation in terms of the ability to connect to basically your utility and plug things in and get electricity to your devices. At least I'd have to see maybe some test cases in that regard that shows that, hey, actually a competing market for outlets leads to, more efficient outlets, I guess. I don't know. I have a hard time believing in that. The last point that I'll make is just that brand equity is a market failure.
I mean, outlets really suck.
Companies,
like, they're notoriously terrible, out of date. They're did you see? There's that guy Technology Connections, the YouTube channel, where he explains all the problems with the standard outlet. It's basically just horribly out of century-old technology, and obvious improvements that could be made. It's completely needlessly dangerous. All sorts of ridiculous stuff. But of course, no one can innovate. I'm not saying that innovation would necessarily happen anyway if it was completely unregulated, but at least it's not clear that the regulation is helping anything.
Yeah, but I'm saying that I don't even know if that's regulated though. Is there actually a U.S. regulation that's, because I'm saying whether this is a market standard or I'm not sure. I really don't know. My point was broader than that, which is to say whether this is a market or a government standard. I think it provides net utility, right? That's pretty much all I'm saying.
Well, standards are fine. I'm all for standards. I'm just saying you don't need the government regulations to have standards. That's my point.
Well, I would never disagree that you don't need the government to have standards. That's not my point. My point is just to say that in these markets that are not competitive, or not, I would say, apologies, not perfectly competitive, I think that a lack of, relatively strict standardization leads to inefficiencies, right? That's all that I'm saying, especially in the short term, right? I'm not sure people would necessarily tolerate it in the short and the medium term. And the long term is harder to predict, obviously. 50 years into an anarcho-capitalist country, I don't know what... it's a little bit harder to predict what the world would look like, but we can come to some conclusions maybe depending on what we'd imagine. But the last thing I was going to say on Apple is that brand equity itself is a market failure. And if you find that corporations are charging a premium associated with their brand equity, that's a market failure that is interesting to hear what an ANCAP would think about it. But if you got a scenario where... Because in a perfectly competitive market, companies shouldn't be able to charge a premium, especially when they're selling a more homogenous, sort of commoditized product, right? And if you're able to do so, that's a market failure. You could say that it's a failure in the sense that, I'm sorry, apologies. You could say it's not a failure in the sense that, consumers are just buying what they want. That's true. But in the case, pulling it back to the Apple example, where Apple is able to basically charge a premium associated with a charger that doesn't have clear benefits, then all of a sudden you end up with basically consumers being, ripped off because of their own psychology, which, I think that's where the government can come in as a third-party arbiter and say, yeah, that's a problem. We don't like that. You have to standardize this.
Well, why? You point these problems and you just say we need government because there's a problem. Why would government solve this problem?
Do you think companies can't take advantage of people? Certainly, you'd agree that companies can take advantage.
Companies
of people,
can do
right?
all sorts of horrible things, and so can governments.
Of course, right? So can governments, right? No, I agree.
Give me an argument for why the government would do better at this than a market. This is what I never get from you.
Because I
use the same criteria to evaluate the two options.
Because a democratically accountable government, I think, results in gains in equity and efficiency in markets, depending on the market that you're talking about, right? That's basically the point that I would make.
But that's not an argument. You're just saying, I think it's better. Why is it better?
Well, you're just saying, I think it's better. We have to
No. I'm comparing. What I do is I argue, let's compare the government and the market using the same criteria. So don't. The government is not some special thing. The government is just another market. So the market fails, let's say, in some situation because people don't have enough information about that's the brand equity you're talking about. Well, people don't have enough information about Apple, so they sort of blindly trust the Apple name. Well, if you add democracy and regulators in there, then why is it that you would somehow get a better decision? Because the same reason people don't have information about Apple, they don't have information about the regulators they're voting for. And
I think they do have information about that, to be fair. I think you might be underselling it.
Why would they have necessarily more information about regulators than about Apple?
Well, because the either the regulators directly or the people the regulators are accountable to are elected by the people, right? And the people who are running for office have to make a sales pitch to the people voting for
Apple
them, right?
has to make a sales pitch to consumers to convince them to choose to buy the Apple products.
I understand that, but insofar as we either disagree or agree, insofar as at least I think that, and I feel like I know this, in the fact that companies can take advantage of their customers, right? Then that should be something that, in my view, is better regulated.
But politicians can do the same. Politicians can lie in the same way companies can. They can mislead voters in the same way companies could mislead their customers, right? So give me a logical argument.
The median voter is much more well represented in terms of I vote for things, I get things by the democratically accountable government than they are by any individual corporation in terms of their consumers.
Why?
Right? Because
why not? The corporation has incentive to make their consumers happy, to make their consumers choose to buy their product.
Okay, no. They don't have an incentive to do that. They have an incentive to make profits. Some things are transitive.
Yeah, well, they make the profits by having revenue, which comes from their customers.
Well, no, there's a significant difference in what we just said, though, is because companies have no obligation to provide, good products, good lives, good access, equitability to their customers. They have no incentive to do that.
The government has no obligation to do that either. They just say they're going to do it, and then we vote them in, and then we hope they do what they said they were going to do.
No, you're wrong about that, though, because the median voter is actually fairly well represented in democracies, right? The median voter tends to get what the median voter wants. Now, when we're talking about different examples,
what do you mean by that? Does that mean something other than consumers tend to get what they want when they choose what to buy?
No. I'm saying that how do I put this? The median voter, obviously, you know what that means. The 50th percentile, person who votes, right? What they believe tends to be reflected in government policy, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that broader society gets what they want, because broader society doesn't necessarily equal the median voter. So there can be discrepancies there, but the median voter tends to get what they want reflected in government policy.
First of all, so the median voter model puts all opinions on a single linear spectrum, right? One-dimensional spectrum. So already you're kind of
not really
vastly simplifying the whole, the possibilities of what people could want, right? You can only choose, basically what you want is a number between 0 and 1 on some spectrum. And you're saying that...
There's different
what
priorities
they tend to get is
can have.
0.5 all the time. Okay, but that doesn't...
No, that's not true. You're misrepresenting what I'm saying, right? So I'm not saying that... How do I put this, right? So for instance, there's polls out there, people will say... 90% of Americans believe in background checks, right? But we don't get, federal background checks, right? And why is that, right? Well, it's because half the people that believe in background checks are Republicans, and they vote for a package deal of Republicans, which tends to include fairly anti-gun regulation Republicans because they're appealing to a broader base of people. Now, does that mean that the median voter is not getting what they want? The answer is no, because the median voter is also prioritizing different issues, right? If the median voter says, hey, I'd love background checks, but I really hate the idea of Democrats raising my taxes, so I'm going to vote for Republicans because that's the priority that I choose. That's what I mean, right? However, when we talk about the incentives from both sides, you say the government has no incentive to I suppose be reflective of what people want. I don't think that that's true. Obviously, democratic governments have...
They don't have any more incentive than businesses. That's all I'm saying.
I think the difference is in how holistic companies have to be in terms of providing a product to people. If you're selling pens, you only really have to care about the profits associated with selling pens, right? If you're the government, you have to care about more than just one thing. And a good example of this might be, for instance, like if I'm providing if I'm generating electricity for the people that, live in this community, right? I only have to care about basically one thing, right? How much do people need electricity? If they need electricity a fuckload, I can charge a lot for electricity if I want and if I can. Depends on how competitive the market is. In case of electricity, not a super competitive market. The point is, let's just keep it there. At the end of the day, though, all of the externalities associated with my production, I don't really have to care about, right? Say that I pollute a lot. I don't really have to care for that because there's so many psychological and economic reasons why companies wouldn't necessarily have to care about the amount of pollution that they're giving off into the environment that everyone has to deal with ultimately.
Why do governments have to care about that more than companies?
Because when we're talking about a collective responsibility in terms of pollution, right? When you emit into the air, that eventually dissipates into, to some even extent, the entirety of the United States, right? Polluting in one area spreads to other areas, right?
Yes.
And that's one of the psychological, moral hazard, basically. That's one of the problems of dealing with pollution, at least at a local level, because if I'm upstream at a river and I'm dumping all of my sewage in a river, I'm not going to give a shit about that because it's all going downstream. And every basically set of pollution is like that. Governments have to care about that, though, because governments are collectively accountable, right? Everyone.
What does that mean collectively? The companies are collectively accountable.
No, but they're only
everyone can choose not to buy from that company, and then the company goes away.
No, but my point is, though, is that the people who live in this town aren't going to choose to just not use electricity, right? Rather, they're going to keep paying their bills, and the pollution that's associated with that company's production, everyone has to.
And they're going to keep paying their taxes. In fact, they can't even choose not to. Even if they don't want electricity, they'll get shot if they don't pay their taxes. They have no choice to not pay the government.
Wait, hold on, stop. What did that have to do with anything that I just said? All that I said was that governments are collectively accountable. So for problems such as moral hazards in markets where they affect everyone cumulatively, collectively, governments who are collectively accountable have a strong role in regulating those problems.
I don't. Well, how are they more collectively accountable than a business?
Because a business, if I am selling electricity, I'm only selling electricity presumably to, say, a town. Like, this is the example, right? One town is buying electricity from me. I'm the electricity provider. I'm the electricity company.
Yeah.
Now, I'm selling that electricity. Let's say it's from coal. It's very pollutive, right? That pollution, sure, it affects the people in the town, but you can't only pollute the town that you're producing electricity for. That pollution goes everywhere across the whole country, right? And so that gives the company, number one, no incentive to actually give a shit how much they're polluting because the townspeople only care insofar as they're only affected, 1/1000th as much, 1/1,000,000th, let's say, as much as everyone else in terms of the pollution resulting from their electricity consumption. So the people don't have a direct incentive either that live in that town, but everyone that lives in the broader country has an incentive to say, we need to regulate coal plants because it pollutes for everyone. People in the coal towns might not care, but we need to regulate this because pollution is downstream. It affects everyone else, despite the consumers or the producers of that pollution.
Okay, so you're saying that basically we need an organization that includes everyone so that no one can externalize their costs. And the government is somehow going to do that. Now the question is, why does the government care about anybody's externalized costs?
Because the people care about it, who are broadly affected by it.
Okay.
And they're accountable to the people.
So now we get into this issue with you're sort of abstracting over the whole democratic process and assuming that people is this sort of collective agents that can make decisions like that and act rationally in their collective interest.
Democracies work.
I don't.
That's fair. Well, you're assuming markets solve every problem, which of course I disagree with.
No, I don't. I'm assuming that democracy has the same market failure that you're talking about, right? Because if people,
but hold on. Can I ask a question really quick? So you wouldn't take the position that markets solve all of these problems?
I would take. What do you mean solve all these problems?
What problems? What societal problems?
I'm taking the position that there's no particular reason that having the state involved would improve the best possible solution to any of these problems. I don't see how
Well,
what the state can
opposite of
do
what
for
I'm
a problem
saying.
like that can't be done in a market. Like, it may be that the market
Right,
can't
you're
solve the
saying-
problem, but
you're
I don't see
saying-
why the state would be any better at solving the problem than a market.
Right. You're saying the market is preferable in terms of all of society's problems, let's say, than the government, right? You know, if you're talking about the government regulating something, you're saying the market would necessarily do a better job.
Yeah.
You'd prefer the market. Right. Okay. Well, then I feel like I represented it fairly enough then. I mean, you're saying you're assuming that the market can solve all of society's problems better than the government, right? Not
Better than the
but I
government,
think
but
that,
not necessarily solve all the problems. Sure.
well, yeah, I guess it'd be interesting to hear. Obviously, there's some you know, if you have relationship trouble, it's hard for the market to solve that, right? But you know, when we're talking about societal problems, it sounds like you're saying that the market would be, you know, a preference to the government, right? And what I'm saying is that I don't think it would, because I don't think the incentives align to such an extent that you know, sometimes market incentives don't align properly with like collective interest or societal interest, right? And
But
I
democracy,
think that's where
but
the
government interests don't align with collective interests, whatever that is. So
they do. Why do you say that?
Because they don't. Because see, why is it okay to abstract over all the voters as some sort of collective interest, but you can't abstract over a market as collective interest? I can't just say, well, all consumers want something.
I described a market where that doesn't work, though. Like I described,
but it doesn't work in government either.
Of a market, I described a situation where the consumers in a market have no incentive to solve the problem. Neither do the producers. But there is a problem. There's the pollution that's being created that we all have to collectively deal with. That is a problem that is not, the incentives don't align in that market, and that's why you need an external entity, you know, to me, a state of government, to come in and say, yeah, we're going to standardize this. We're going to say you have to, you know, pay a tax on that. We're going to say that you have to decrease your emissions flat out. We're going to say you have to invest in renewable energy. You know, incentivize it however you want. I mean, you know.
So first of all,
instead of saying half, say incentivize. I mean, I don't know.
So you're talking about a situation where you have one entity that is polluting, and you know that this one entity is polluting. It seems to, so in that situation, you have a rights violation, right? This entity is you know, they're aggressing on other people, to put it in libertarian terms, I guess. And you should be able to sue someone if they're polluting your property. And if they're polluting 100 people's property, then 100 people should be able to sue them. That's fine. And you can do that in a stateless society. So that's probably what, you know, I'd say that's what you could expect to happen in that situation without a state.
Yeah, you could think that could happen.
The externality happens. The problem is when you have, you know, when everyone is polluting, and collectively, it's in their collective interest to not pollute, but it's in nobody's individual interest to not pollute, because they get the benefits and they don't have to pay the cost of their pollution, right? That's the sort of classical market failure situation, and that's the situation that you also get when in democracy, right? Because everyone, you know, when you vote, you're voting for what everyone gets, not just what you get, and you're putting the cost on everyone, not just you. And I mean, you're not even getting any benefit, but you are getting the benefit of no, you know, the feeling that you get from voting for someone. So even if you were, it's broken in so many ways, right? Like even if you got some benefit from voting, that would be a problem. But since you don't get any benefit from voting, it's not clear that people have any incentive to base their votes on what's good for or bad for society at all. And then
you don't think people get any benefit from voting?
No. Well, they don't have any effect on anything.
What?
Well, I mean,
I don't understand how you can make that statement genuinely. You think that I think
they do get a benefit, but it's not the policy that they vote for that's the benefit. That's not what, because you don't get that, right? If you vote for a person, that does not guarantee that person's going to be elected. In fact, it actually has approximately zero effect on the outcome. So
we're talking about
basic economics tells you that if your choice has zero effect on what you get, then your choice is not going to be motivated by what you get, right? That's just sort of basic.
Right, but one consumer does not have an effect on what the market sells, right?
Well, but they do have an effect on what they get and what they pay, right? They pay the cost and they get the benefits of that decision. So they have an individual motivation to make a good choice. When it comes to voting, they don't, because what they vote for is not what they're going to pay for or what they get. So
no, you do have an individual incentive to vote for good policy.
Why?
Insofar
What's
as you're
the
self-interested.
You'll get the same thing either way.
The same either. What do you mean either way?
You're going to get the same thing regardless of what you vote for.
That's not. I don't understand how you're saying. Okay.
How do
if you vote for different people and different people get elected,
talking about one vote,
different
here.
policies
one vote.
be enacted.
No.
Yeah, and but okay,
not one vote.
Okay, last year's name. If we're talking about $1, right? You're not moving the market in one way or another. And insofar as people are geographically limited,
no, you are.
What they have the option.
Well, you don't have to move the market though. You only have to affect what you get when you go out and buy something. Your choice determines whether you will pay the cost of that thing and whether you will get that thing. If you choose, you'll pay the cost to get the thing. If you choose not to, you won't get it. Your choice has an effect, and that's why the cost and the benefits affect your choice. That's why it motivates you.
But that
is not true with voting.
Comments.
What?
That's not at all a comment on the nature of moral hazard and the ability of market to regulate moral hazard, though, right?
No, that's absolutely what it's about. That's why pollution's a problem, because you don't pay the cost of it, right? Because the cost is externalized.
My point is there's no way to make individuals who pollute to always pay the direct cost of their pollution.
Yes,
you can't scoop out the carbon.
That's the problem.
Yeah, okay, right. And so,
but democracy,
problem, you're saying
voting has that problem.
No, but you're saying, I assume in my world, people will be able to sue you because you might consider, I don't even know how this would work. Like the carbon, everyone in the whole country, I guess, will get together and they'll coordinate a lawsuit against the town that has the coal plant, and they'll say, "Hey, 300 million."
They don't have to coordinate anything. Just sue them individually.
Sue who individually?
The one who's polluting.
Okay, no. That's what I'm saying. Is that you'd have to somehow get some arbitrary number of people together and say, "Hey, we're all going to sue you, the coal plant, because we are considering your pollution a violation of our rights." Right?
Why do you need a group?
Okay, my God, this system sounds crazily inefficient. So you're saying
you're talking about different things here. If you want to talk about how does the justice system work and how do lawsuits work, we can talk about that. If we want to talk about
well, we're walking through it right now. So here's how it works in my system. You vote for people that are more, climate friendly. They pass policies that are more climate friendly. I feel like that's fairly simple. I think that it comes down to ultimately you have to advocate for your position and get people to vote for it. Sure, right? But in terms of collective accountability, efficiency of process, I think that's more efficient than your system. It sounds like in your system, and we're walking through it right now, you'd have every individual would be able to say, "Hey, rights enforcement agency, I want to sue this coal plant because they're producing pollution, and that's a violation of my rights." So this coal plant would have to perpetually deal with arbitration from, millions of people that are in theory transitively affected by their production of electricity. I mean, how does that sound more efficient?
Okay, let's be clear about the situation we're talking about. We're talking about the situation where there's one polluter and everybody knows who it is. So we know where the pollution is coming from. Right?
Yeah, the coal plants or whatever in the town.
Okay.
Sure.
So right now, you can, generally speaking, you can sue someone for that, right? If someone pollutes, someone puts toxic gas on your property, you can sue them, right? It's illegal in this today's society.
As far as I'm aware, no, I don't.
You don't need environmental regulation, and you don't need environmental regulations to deal with that, right? You know who the polluter is.
No, but that's not true though. As far as I'm aware, there's not a regulation saying, "Hey, I can sue a coal plant because they're producing greenhouse gas emissions, and I might be breathing in those specific greenhouse gas emissions," right?
Well, if there's not, there could be, right? We could easily do that.
I don't think we could. There's no way to implement that. I don't.
Why not?
Because you didn't. Because you'd have to somehow prove in the market that we live in. You'd have to somehow prove that the people, this specific coal plant is the one that polluted the air that I breathe, even though that's not.
But
actually
we
how
know
it
that.
works.
You said there was just one polluter.
No, there's one polluter, but it's not just. That's the whole point of the example. Is that it's not just the town that's affected by that pollution. It's millions of other people that pollution ends up drifting to.
Yeah, but there's only one polluter. All those millions of people, they know who to go and sue. You can show in court the pollution is coming from this one company, and I'm suing them because there's pollution on my property. I can show you measured the air.
No, it's one polluter in that town, but presumably the millions of other people live in towns with their own electric grids and their own electricity companies, right? Some electricity companies and some electricity.
Okay, so now we're talking about multiple. Now we're talking about multiple polluters.
No. but we've always been talking about multiple polluters because obviously the other people suing are going to have electricity, right? What I'm pointing out is that in the example where we've isolated a town, the consumers in that town and the producers in that town have no internal incentive to care about how much pollution is being produced by their consumption or by their production. So you require an external entity. You're saying that external entity would be all the millions of other people who I guess consider basically carbon pollution to be a form of rights violation. And I'm saying that external entity would be the government. I think the government would be a better external entity to appeal to with regards to regulating emissions. You're saying, well, if you're considering carbon emissions a rights violation, you might be able to get a rights enforcement agency to sue that town's rights enforcement agency, and then you're in arbitration. I mean, I feel like I'm describing that pretty fairly to your side.
In a situation, yes, in a situation where you have one polluter or a small number of polluters, you can figure out where the pollution is coming from, then you can sue them, right? You could do that in any system, with or without a state. If you're talking about the problem of like where everyone can pollute and you can't incentivize, you can't practically sue them for doing it, and you can't, and they have an incentive to do it, and they're not paying the cost of it. That's a different problem. Is that what we're talking about? Because that's a problem where I mean, people might say like you need the government to do something about that. But then it's not clear why we would expect the government to be able to do that better. If the government is being elected by the people and who are all polluting, it's not clear why those people would vote to make the government stop them from polluting if they're not willing to just stop polluting, right? How is putting the voting in the middle there somehow make them decide to do the right thing, to act against their best interest?
Because I don't think a rights enforcement agency, I mean, by nature, really, right?
Hold on, we're not talking about rights enforcement agencies. We're just talking about why does the government, if people
why could they do it better?
People are polluting because they have an incentive to pollute because they're not paying the cost of polluting. It's externalized. Why would they vote for regulators that stop them from polluting? They're not willing to stop polluting.
Oh, okay, yeah. So if we're moving one step away from the comparison of the rights enforcement agencies versus the government, why would voters be incentivized to do that? It's because voters are a collective, right? Now, obviously, they're a collective in the sense that they all vote. They might vote for different things. But when we talk about things like pollution, where we all have to deal with air pollution, well, obviously, in scenarios where, hey, I live in a world with a little bit more of a clean grid, but the parts of the dirty grid that we do have are originating from, say, where you live. Well, I don't like that. We all have to deal with pollution. So we're all more likely to vote for a clean grid overall. This is exactly what's happening in America. Well, hold on, let me explain. This is exactly what's happening in America today, where you've got some areas like Indiana and West Virginia that are super duper coal heavy, super duper pollutive, but the whole country decides, both in regulation and in markets, to say, hey, we understand that you're going to have to deal with localized losses, but we're going to vote for that because we want to transition away from your dirty energy that you produce. That's what's happening right now.
I don't understand what you mean by the whole country decides to vote for this. Why doesn't the whole country just decide to stop polluting? If that's allegedly whatever that means.
Because if I live in Texas and my air is dirtier because of the electric production in your state of West Virginia, I can't just decide to pollute less because you keep changing the hypothetical here. I'm just talking about individual people. It's all the same hypothetical.
No, it's not. Like, are we talking about individual people?
Okay, let's go back to the one town. If I'm an individual living outside of the town that's producing the pollution that I have to deal with, I can't just say, hey, I'm going to stop producing pollution because I'm not the one producing it. It's this town over here that's producing it. Right? It's always been the same example, fundamentally.
Okay, so now you're talking about a specific situation where one entity's polluting, and they're polluting other people's property, and those people don't want them to do it. I would say that's a legal matter. Like that's a rights enforcement issue, because you know who's polluting.
Right.
Right.
Well, that's why I was trying to compare the two. Right. I'm comparing the efficiency.
What's the comparison?
The comparison is right. So it's government regulating. Like we're using air pollution as an example, government regulating air pollution versus rights enforcement agencies regulating air pollution. which one does it better? That's kind of the conversation.
Okay, I don't think you really need to regulate air pollution. I don't know. I guess you do. I think you need something that says, like, if you own some property, then nobody has the right to mess up the air on your property. So I would say you don't need a government to have that rule and to have it enforced in a society. I think you can have a decentralized legal system that can enforce that right.
But how could an external rights enforcement agency possibly enforce the rule that says you, represented by another rights enforcement agency, cannot produce the type of electricity that you produce? How could that possibly necessarily be the conclusion?
I'm not sure. If someone's polluting, someone's like pumping toxic gas on your property, you call your rights.
No, that's not what we're talking about.
What are we talking about?
No, we're talking about carbon emissions, right? Sure. This is something that you can live with, but it's bad for you, and you don't want to live with it, right? So it's not as it's hard. It's a harder question than like literally producing toxic waste that's gonna cause you to be radioactive, right? My question is, in a scenario where we see, hey, carbon emissions are a problem because it makes the air dirtier and it makes our climate change is a problem. How does one rights enforcement agency possibly say, hey, you guys represented by another rights enforcement agency that says it is okay to pollute, you're not allowed to do that anymore? How do we make that decision?
Lots of people want to pay for the right to not have people pollute their property. Not many people want the right to pollute other people's property. I mean, so those two, I guess some people want that, right? But those two entities are going to.
The only way to stop it, the only way to stop the pollution coming onto your side of the property is by telling them they cannot produce the electricity that they want,
or they can't. Whatever they can do, they can't put pollute your property.
So what I'm saying is that if
polluting property is no different than just like assaulting you or something. Like it's effectively.
It absolutely is, though. It is.
Why?
It is different.
What's the difference?
Because if you punch me in the face, there's two clear parties that are responsible for that, and it's a little bit easier to say, "Hey, you don't punch me in the face." However, when we're talking about
there is a clear party. You said there was a clear party.
No, there is a clear party responsible.
Yeah.
But it's not clear that one rights enforcement agency would have the right to say, your town, with your rights enforcement agency, you have to stop producing your electricity because it's polluting our side of the fence.
It's clear to me. I'm trying to explain how this would work.
Why would they? But why would the rights enforcement agency in the town come to that conclusion? They would never agree on that. They'd never agree on that.
What?
I mean, we're talking about.
What do you mean?
We're paying you to
agree? Yeah, they would agree on that because they have to.
Why would the rights enforcement agency of the company and the town producing the coal electricity, why would they agree to stop producing that electricity?
First of all, the town has nothing to do with it. We're talking about a one entity, this company that wants to pollute other people's property, and all these other people who don't want the property polluted. Now, if the right to pollute other people's property is really something that a lot of people want and are willing to pay for, then potentially they could have that right. But I suspect that what people actually want is the right to prevent other people from polluting their property. And there's going to be much bigger market for that right than the market for the right to pollute other people's property. And those market forces will incentivize, so the rights enforcement agencies that want to make money are going to prefer the right to stop other people from polluting. And in order to not go to war with those rights enforcement agencies that are making all this money selling that popular right, you will have to make treaties with them to follow the same rules. Or go to war with them, but you'll probably lose because they got more money than you, because they're selling a more valuable right that people want.
In a world entirely governed by dollars, the people with the most power will be the people with the most dollars, right? And when we're talking about the relative power, what people want, you keep saying what people want. No, it's what the most dollars wants, right? And I think that with regards to that, if we can certainly imagine, because it happens today,
it just isn't
as effective because we have That's what I'm saying, right? It could happen today, but it isn't as effective because we have a democratically accountable government. When you're saying, oh, no, like people wouldn't want the right of being able to pollute. Well, yeah, sure, like some people wouldn't, but what about the millions of people that live in areas that have pollutive electric grids? What about the, presumably tens of billions, trillions of dollars of capital that are backing producers of carbon-intensive technology?
Well, they don't want
have all the incentive in the world to not give up their right.
They don't want their property polluted. just to get electricity. I mean, if you
They
really
want-
need to
they
do
don't
that to
want-
get electricity, then fine.
No,
But
they don't want you sidestepped though. They don't want their property polluted, sure. But what they know is that the cost of their production is evenly distributed, but the gains of their production aren't evenly distributed. They're distributed directly to the people who own the company. So there's all the incentive in the world to say, don't stop us from polluting. We're giving you cheap electricity, so you probably don't want it as a consumer.
but it's not cheap.
Don't
It's
stop us from
expensive
polluting.
because they have to
No,
pay for the
don't
right to
stop us.
pollute other people's property.
No,
and that's
but the
cost going to be
cost
passed on to the
is evenly
consumers.
distributed. No.
What do you mean evenly distributed?
Because pollution, I mean, when I say evenly distributed, there's obviously a particle limitation there, but like when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, right? That goes into the air and dissipates completely with the blow of the wind, right? I mean, it's distributed amongst everyone in society.
But it doesn't matter if you know who it's coming from, then you can use rights enforcement against them to make it expensive for them to do that, because they'll have to pay for the right to pollute if they don't want the market for rights enforcement to make them not allowed to do that.
You're saying that the demand for a right not to basically the demand for a right to say you cannot pollute, that will be more valuable than the demand for a right to pollute. What I'm saying is the complete opposite, right? That's totally not true.
Well, if it's not true, then it's probably
way more money.
I'd say if that's not true, then it's probably economically beneficial to pollute. If people don't want it that badly and they'd rather have the electricity that's coming from this pollution, then I think you should pollute. You can make that electricity.
Certainly.
We have to make those decisions somehow, right? We have to make those trade-offs.
No, I agree. So, no, I totally agree. So, my point is to say that, well, it appears that we agree now, right? So, we agree.
Right. So, why do you think the government makes those decisions better than a market?
Exactly. So, if we agree at that point, and this is actually a valuable concession because it allows us to move on in the conversation. If we agree that certainly, at least in the case of pollution, market forces wouldn't align properly to eliminate pollution. Now the question becomes, well, how does the government do that? Okay, so my answer to how the government does that is
hold on. Just to be clear, we don't want to eliminate pollution. We want to find the optimal balance between pollution and the goods that come from polluting. There's going to be some benefit where the cost of the pollution and the benefit of those goods are balanced out, and that's what we're trying to find, right? We don't want zero pollution. That wouldn't be optimal.
I don't know. I mean, as an ideal, we would prefer zero pollution. I get what you're saying is that given
because everything pollutes, right?
So it doesn't have to, though, right?
Yes, it does. I mean, inevitably, there's always some kind of pollution, whether it's like noise pollution.
There doesn't have to be, though. You could recycle everything and carbon capture whatever you can't, right? I mean,
well, we probably don't want to do that. That's probably not worth it.
No, I understand. It's a small point. I'm just saying, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have any. It's possible to have productive processes with no pollution, right? That's all I'm saying.
But there's always going to be like eliminating every single molecule of carbon emission would not be efficient. That would be a horrible world, right?
I agree. It would be dollar on a dollar.
So there's going to be
some
some pollution is good. We want some pollution because the optimal balance.
No pollution is good.
Hold on.
There's no such thing as good pollution.
Emitting a molecule of carbon is pollution, right?
Yeah, that's not good. It's not. There's no amount of pollution.
But it is good. In order to,
it's not good.
You can't even breathe without. That means it's good for everyone to stop breathing, because by breathing we're emitting carbon and polluting.
Right. But that's where we're getting sidetracked here. But it's an interesting sidetrack. It's to say that no pollution is good, but some pollution is probably necessary. Right. I wouldn't call it good though. It's not good.
When I say good,
carbon.
When I say good, as I said, I'm talking about the optimal balance between the benefits of polluting and the cost of polluting. So breathing is probably worth the cost of the carbon that we emit in order to stay alive.
Yeah, we all make that choice, right? It's a marginal point.
That's why when I say that the carbon that you breathe out is good. What was your bigger point, though? The bigger point, I just trying to clarify that we're not trying to eliminate pollution. We're trying to find this optimal balance, which is going to be tricky, right? It's going to be weighing, seeing what do we get from polluting and what is the actual cost of polluting, and finding and putting a value on those that we can compare, right? And that's what we're saying. What does that better, markets or government, right?
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, and what I'm saying is that governments do, it appears apologies, we agree that markets don't necessarily align incentives with regards to pollution, right? I would, however, say that the government is incentivized to address pollution and carbon emissions as a problem. And, frankly, it's as easy as just pointing to the current policies that we've passed as a country, right? I mean, we've passed policies that attempt to address the spurring production of clean energy and eliminating carbon emissions across different governments and democracies. And the reason that they passed those is because of people wanting them. The reason people wanted them is because they see the effects of climate change as a collective. They decided to vote for policies that, address those problems.
Okay, so we go down this road. Like you can all. Problem is we don't have any empirical data about how pollution is how these problems are handled in stateless societies, because there really haven't been any stateless societies.
Oh, I'm sorry, stateless society. Well, yes, all the stateless societies were all hundreds of years ago. Yeah, sure, that's
so. We can't really have,
except for like Java or something.
We can't do like an empirical comparison of whether carbon is handled better with a state and without a state. And you can point to anecdotes saying, well, it seems like government did these good things for carbon emission, but I can also point to things and say, well, see, like I'd say the government screwed up in dealing with this problem and they could have done better. And we're going to get stuck.
Would you agree that we can point to examples of less regulated societies that had worse problems with pollution? I mean, if you compare like India to like America,
the problem with that
Yeah,
approach is because just because a society is less regulated doesn't mean it's more stateless, right? Because if the government, you can say it. I mean, you could argue that, but then you could also argue, well, that's the government is responsible for regulating, and they're not doing it. So that's just an example of how the government is failing in their responsibility, right?
No, it's an example. No, because the argument from your point of view is that for instance, right? If it's say in India, right? In India, they have a huge problem with the pollution in their rivers, right? There's just really, really dirty rivers. There's trash everywhere. India's, I mean, I don't mean to sound offensive or anything. India's certainly many redeeming qualities, right? But there's obviously a big problem with like waste management, let's say in India, right? And from my point of view, what I would say, I'd be interested to hear your response. My point of view is that the market in India is not disallowed from solving that problem. They can solve the problem of producing too much plastic waste and shit like that.
I would argue that the existence of the state makes it difficult to does not allow for to have a market to actually deal with those problems, because you can't, for example, have a rights enforcement agency that is free to actually enforce rights, because they're stuck with the government legal system. And there's any business that exists, any organizations that has to exist under the government regulations. So that puts that puts a pretty big handicap on what the private sector can do when you have a state.
Well, let me ask you a direct question. Okay, so let's take India out of the example. Let's say that we have a town that has a problem with, and let's say it's in a stated society. We have a town within a government, within a stated society, and they have a problem where like people are just taking all their trash and they're just throwing it in the river, right? And so their river is basically a fucking sludge-filled nuclear waste dump looking horrible place, right? Now the river goes downstream, so it gets cleared out eventually, but there's like these long-term effects or whatever. Now, in my view, that world would benefit from the government coming in and saying, hey, you can't throw your trash in the river, and also to the companies that are producing these products, you can't use as much plastic, you have to use more biodegradable stuff, like whatever, however to solve that if people do throw it on the ground or whatever it is. That's the solvency for that problem. Now, however, in that current society that led up to that point, and we agree that those types of societies exist with more problems with waste management, the government would not prevent any one of those companies from using more biodegradable materials in their products. The government wouldn't prevent any company from starting an organization to try and help clean up the rivers and make them cleaner. The government wouldn't stop, obviously, consumers from not throwing their trash in the river.
No,
right?
But it would. So it would stop people from protecting the river, because nobody is allowed to own the river because the government owns it. The government owns it, and they're letting people throw crap in it. It also wouldn't let people use force to stop people from throwing crap in the river. Right? Only the police are allowed to do that, and if the police don't do it, no one else can do it.
So you think that you think if companies were allowed to pay for police to protect rivers, they would?
Not necessarily companies, but I mean any option that involves force that you're not allowed to use in a state, in a side with the state that the police have, only a monopoly on, is not an option. We can't.
Well, why don't
we can't
they?
test
Why don't,
that.
so you're saying no? That's what I'm saying. So you're saying the only reason companies don't currently go out of their way to pay for police to protect rivers in towns is because they're not allowed. They're not. Well, they can pay security to be fair, but
the party I would expect to protect the river is the party that owns the river.
Right. So you're saying that if you own a segment of the river,
yeah.
But how could you? But no. But how could you? How could you? Again, there's no way to enforce, because you probably wouldn't buy the whole river, right? Because rivers are pretty long and it's pretty expensive, right? So you'd probably buy like a section of the river, right? Yep. But this is the same problem with the other pollution example. If I lived upstream, and I lived in a say a town that this is literally a thing that happens in India, the Ganges River. People that live upstream, it's clean upstream the river, and then downstream is where all the poor people live, and they have to actually deal with a lot of the trash that the rich people throw away, right? And so, in similar example, right, if I lived upstream and I had a rights enforcement agency that said, yeah, you're allowed to throw trash in the river, that's totally fine. Obviously, this town has a demand for that right. And then downstream, you guys lived in the shitter part of the community that had to deal with all of the trash in the river, and then all of a sudden, oh, well, we own this part of the river, so we're going to take our rights enforcement agency and say, hey, you guys upstream, you're violating our rights because your pollution is downstream from us. How does the rights enforcement agency of the town that lives upstream, how is that rights enforcement agency ever incentivized to tell its own customers, I know you pay us for this right, but you're no longer allowed to exercise it? It just doesn't seem like the incentives would be there. But a collectively
they're incentivized to agree to rule.
My last sentence would be that a collectively accountable government that has votes from both the wealthy upstreamers and the poor downstreamers, where obviously there's probably more poor people than rich people, they get voted in, and then that government tells, as a broad societal rule, you've got to do this. You can't pollute in rivers anymore.
So how I'd expect that to work is you have a polluter upstream, and so we already talked about this before, basically. But you have a polluter upstream and you polluter downstream, and they have different rights enforcement agencies. Sorry, a person downstream is getting polluted. So the reason the rights enforcement agency of the upstream person would agree to general rules that you're not allowed to pollute other people's property is because that's probably the more popular rule, right? People generally want control over their property more than they want to be able to control other people's property, and they're willing to pay for that, right?
But there's a different demand curve, though, right? Like similarly to how a voter might have priorities, different people might have different demand curves for that type of a right. And so the wealthy people living upstream might be, in terms of priority, they might be a lot more willing to throw dollars at securing that right than the poor people will have dollars to disband that right. And so this is the inequality of
why are you assuming that the one of them is rich and the other one's poor? I mean, generally, if it's more valuable, never mind what they want. If it's more valuable
everywhere, across all of human history, pollution's always disproportionately affected poor people.
Let's just talk about the value of the rights. If the right to not have your property polluted is more valuable than the right to pollute other people's property, then I would expect that the market for rights enforcement would settle on the right to not have your property polluted. And I think
why are you assuming that would be where the market would settle on, right? Because again, when we're in a world
because
where
it is more
the most dollars, no, it's not though. You think it's more valuable because
so I don't know
that
if it is more valuable, then that's what the market. There's more money to be made, and so that's probably what the market will settle on. And if it's not more valuable, then the market won't do it, which is good because it's more valuable, right?
No, but why are you? But why? I don't understand this. Why are you? And this is like. I feel like this is fairly basic from, like, you might learn this in like your first like econ lecture, right? It was the idea that socially optimal outcomes don't necessarily equal economically optimal outcomes, right? And so similarly, when we're talking about like, say a bunch of rich people are willing to like pour money into the right to pollute a river downstream, in that regard, that right is more valuable. You're saying, well, it's better because it's more valuable. But how is that better for society when a bunch of rich people say, yeah, we can pollute your water? How is that more valuable for society? I mean, the price of that right is higher, but how does that mean society is better off?
I mean, they're paying for that right, and you're saying that
They are, sure.
and they're saying that they can outbid the people who don't want them to pollute the river.
They can.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds, and if that's true, it sounds to me like it's good for society to pollute that river. I mean, if people would rather pollute, if people are willing to pay more to pollute the river than they're willing to stop the polluting of the river, then it's probably some sort of benefit to pollute the river.
No, but it's.
I mean, otherwise, why are they willing to pay for it?
They're willing to pay for it because they don't face the direct costs of their actions.
But paying for it is a direct cost. That's the cost. They have to pay for the right. They have to outbid the people who are trying to stop them. It internalizes the cost, right? It gets rid of the externality.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, because the issue lies in the fact that the people who are living downstream, there's a lot more of them who have a lot more problems associated with the pollution from the upstream people than the wealthy people have to pay in terms of achieving that right, because they have a lot more money, right? At the end of the day, you're probably not paying like an incredibly large portion of your net worth to pay for the right to pollute. Whereas these other poor people just don't simply have the money in order to bid up the price of not polluting as a right.
But you just okay. So this is another thing I often encounter is people just throw in like these people are rich and these people are poor arbitrarily in a hypothetical to say, well, this is why it's not going to work. But why are one of them rich and why one of them poor? Like there's no particular reason.
I certainly don't. No. It's not that. I certainly don't.
Like what about all the rich people who don't want their land polluted and the poor people who want to pollute? Like I can just switch the roles.
In our society, right? It's more. It's one person, one vote, right? Obviously, there's electoral.
No. Hold on. I want to answer this. Why would you expect that it would be the rich people in general who would want to pay to pollute, and the poor people who'd want to pay to stop them? That doesn't make. I don't see any reason for that skew to exist.
Yeah, okay, so in the example where the poor people lived upstream and the rich people lived downstream, you would end up with a society where...
No, why do the poor people live upstream? Like, you can't just throw that in there. Why would you... Like, we're talking about in society in general, so why would you expect the rich people to live upstream and the poor people to live downstream?
Yeah, okay, well, no. So when it comes to this specific example, that's just the example we outlined. However, the broader point on pollution, right, and this is a direct answer to your question, I know that it is in all of human history, pollution has been disproportionately emitted by rich people, and disproportionately the harms of pollution have been felt by poorer people. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to say that in a world that... Well, hold on, let me just finish. So I don't think it's unfair to say, this is my last sentence, is that in a world that is governed entirely by who has the most dollars, right, that is a world with a hell of a lot more pollution.
It's not governed by who has the most dollars. That's a simplification.
You agreed? No, hold on, chat. I may have misheard.
It's governed by the dollars.
I thought you said, well, yeah, we agree. It's governed by who has the most dollars. You necessarily have to agree with that, because, I mean,
in order, like, you have to spend those dollars to get things, right? So if you're wasting your dollars on things that are not valuable, you're not rich. You're not going to be rich. The people who are rich are the ones who spend their money smartly. We don't waste their money.
No, I understand. No, but nobody thinks like that, right? Obviously, if, for instance, like we all have discretionary income, we don't not everyone spends all of their dollars perfectly responsibly, right? People like amenities. They like luxuries. Rich people don't drive around in fucking pickup trucks like, Warren Buffett would have you believe. Rich people like more shit, more consumer little bullshit, right? And so when it comes to the history of pollution and polluting across, not only across individual people, but also across countries, when you get wealthier, you tend to pollute more. And outside of the government regulating that, unfortunately, it seems that society just doesn't have the effort or the ability to regulate that on a dollar basis, right? I don't think it's unreasonable to assume, which is what's been true for all of human history, that wealthy people, wealthy countries pollute more, and poor people in poorer countries are disproportionately the unfortunate benefactors of the consequences of that pollution.
Okay, so first of all, you're talking about on the level of countries here, which is very, very different than what we're talking about.
Well, you could. I know. I'm saying you could either way. There's two empirically rich people and rich countries. It's the same story either way, right?
I don't think you can just directly analogize between rich countries and rich people, because
I'm not
countries are
analogizing.
states.
I'm saying
Countries are run by states, and states are what I'm arguing against here, right?
But in an anarcho-capitalist society, you'd have richer and poorer communes, right? So I'm just saying that whether we're talking about on the individual level or on like the broader, more collective level, in your case, maybe communes, in my case, countries, it's, the wealthier you are, the more you pollute.
I don't know where you got communes.
No. Okay. Would you agree that in an anarchist society, people would form communities?
I don't
like
what's
it wouldn't
a community?
Just literally be like.
What do you mean by that?
Okay, well, I think you're being a little pedantic here. Obviously, we would agree that
there's nothing that forces them to do any particular thing as a community. They could form a community if they want, but they're free to take.
That's what I'm.
They're free to collectivize on any scale for any particular part of their economic activity.
There's no disagreement,
right?
Unlike
now, where everyone is forced to do a whole lot of things at the state level and no other.
Yeah. Right? The only thing I mentioned was that when it comes to the what do you call it? Apologies, I got a little sidetracked in my mind. I just saw some news on my phone. When it comes to the level of countries or to people, the only analogy that I'm making is that it seems to be the case historically that wealthy people and wealthy countries disproportionately pollute, and poor people in poor countries disproportionately have to deal with the consequences of that pollution. Now, you agreed earlier in this conversation, about 30 minutes ago.
See where can you justify that somehow? Because it's the poor neighborhoods that look pretty filthy to me. I mean, the rich neighborhoods are always clean. What did you say?
Well, you have to look at how the waste management actually works in that regard, right? Where the waste ends up going.
So,
right? So I'm not saying poor people don't pollute. I'm not saying poor people don't pollute, but when we're talking about per capita emissions and production of pollution, it is not poor people that are leading that pack. It is wealthy people in wealthy countries, right? Now, you agreed earlier in this conversation, it appeared that you agreed that earlier in this conversation, you said, okay, I will agree. It is the case, certainly, that we were talking about pollution in the air. It is the case that sometimes you might have it to where the price of the right to pollute is bid up beyond the price to not pollute, to enforce non-pollution. And so my point is that as we agreed that in your society, which is governed by basically who has the most dollars and can bid up the rights that they want, pollution would be a hell of a problem because it's not one person, one vote. It's $1, one vote. And whoever has the most dollars tends to be the wealthy people. And because of that, we would probably expect a lot less regulation with regards to pollution because rich people are insulated from the consequences of pollution a lot better than poor people. We're using the example of a town in both, the water pollution and the air pollution, but the aggregate truth is what I just said. How do we ensure environmental equity in this regard? We can't. We're assuming that the most valuable right is the one that's best for society, but that's obviously not true.
Okay. I'm certainly not saying that you're going to get zero pollution, that it solves the externalities of pollution. In a situation...
I didn't say you said that.
In a situation where people can, and you can't stop them from polluting, you can't make them pay the cost, the rights enforcement is probably not going to help. Like things with like carbon emission, you can't tell where the carbon's coming from. The cost of making people stop emitting, since the cost is spread out over everyone, no one has an incentive to pay to stop it from happening from anybody else.
No one has that incentive.
Right.
But collectively, we do have that incentive.
Now, but then we're back to the question: why would we expect government to be able to solve that problem? Because again, because people don't have any incentive at all to vote for governments that do anything in particular by the same logic. Now you could say, well, I think people do vote, blah, 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 but we're talking about economic incentives here. And if we're just looking at economic incentives, then there's no economic incentive to vote any which way whatsoever, since voting has no effect, since nobody pays any cost or gets any reward from their individual choice to vote. So I don't even understand how you could make an economic argument that people have an incentive to vote any particular way, unless you look at,
I just don't understand this point. There's obviously economic incentives to vote.
What is the incentive? What do you get for voting?
Let's say that let's say you're a minimum wage worker and you're voting for, say, a politician. You have the option of two politicians. One says, but now I would never raise the minimum wage. Another one says I'll raise it to $15 an hour.
Right.
Obviously, your incentive in that regard to
No,
vote for the guy that's going to raise it to 15.
it's not, because, okay, remember, you don't get the guy you vote for. You're not guaranteed to get the guy you vote for. You're not, in fact, voting for that guy
Right.
has a negligible influence on the probability you will get the guy you vote
Yes.
for.
Okay. I get what you're saying. Okay. So you're,
And people know that.
Let me restate what you're saying. So you're saying that because a single person only has a single vote in a world of, in the U.S., hundreds of millions of votes or whatever it is, 100 million plus votes. Because that's the case, you're saying that there's not really that much of an incentive to vote, because not only are there so many votes, your vote might not actually make a difference, right? Because
It doesn't.
the other guy might win. No, but it could, though. Obviously, you're working in probabilities when it comes to democracy.
The
right?
probability, it only makes a difference if the guy wins by one vote, and the chance of that happening is, in any significant size election, is near
right,
zero.
But yeah, but sure. But in your system, it only makes a difference if you're that last marginal dollar that causes the price of a right to go up or down to where it beats the other right, right? So in both scenarios,
you can choose
totally
where you buy
correct.
your rights from. You can change any time. You can switch to
Yes,
another
but
rights
you
enforcement
keep-
agency.
Now you keep on ignoring it. You're ignoring the example. So I agree you can choose where you buy your rights from, right? But what you agreed with earlier in this conversation was in the case of pollution, right? You can choose to buy your rights from one agency, and the people that are polluting buy their rights from another agency. But at the end of the day, if the people who buy the rights to pollute have more money, you still have to deal with the pollution, right? You cannot pay your way out of not dealing with the pollution. Okay? That's my point.
You're saying just more money. It's not how much money they have. It's how much they're willing to spend on this right and how valuable it is to them, right? Keep in mind, this right is not infinitely valuable to them. If it's
the money that they had in combination with the demand,
they're
for the
only
right,
going to
of
pay
course.
for the right to pollute if they're actually making some money back by being able to pollute, right? And then you got to ask, well, how are they making that money back? Are they making some product that people are paying a lot for? Well, it seems like they're actually producing some value in that case, right? So part of the cost of producing that product is the cost of the right to create the pollution that's needed to make that product. And that cost will go into the cost of the product, which will go back to the consumer. So the consumers are paying for this.
Coal plants don't produce no value. I would never make that claim. Obviously, they produce a value. They produce electricity. People want electricity. They're producing value in that regard. Of course, I'd agree with that, right? However, we're just talking about the relative propensity of those different groups to pay for different rights. And when we're talking about, like, say, coal companies as an in anarcho-capitalism, most people don't defend the idea of corporations, but coal company owners as a collective, right? They have essentially an inelastic demand for the right to produce air pollution. So if we assume that coal companies, or basically just, aggregately fossil, people who produce air pollution, aggregately, they're going to have a fuckload more money, probably, than the poor people who disproportionately are affected by their pollution, then both the demand curve and the actual aggregate amount of dollars would lead one to believe that certainly they would just pay for the right to pollute. Now, you say, even if they do that, they're clearly creating value, but I disagree that the value you're creating is more than the societal value.
The money comes from the people buying their electricity, right? It's the consumers paying for it in the end. So the consumers are paying for this coal company or this electricity company to produce electricity for them, and part of the cost of that is paying for the right to pollute whatever they need to do to produce it.
Yeah,
and
I totally agree.
So the consumers are bidding against themselves. In other words, they're choosing what to pay for. Do I want electricity or do I want clean air?
Yeah, no. Well, I think there's two problems with that. So one is that you're right that consumers, an owner gets his money from the products he sells, obviously, right? So consumers have to give him their money in order to get money themselves, right?
Right.
But the demand curves are different, right? So like I said, there's a huge, gigantic pile of money where the demand for the right to pollute air is virtually inelastic because their entire wealth and well-being is based on that right? Basically the wealthy people who own the coal and the gas companies or whatever it is. And then you're right.
Wait,
you've
hold
got
on.
The consumers.
Just so I understand.
Well, hold on. Just
what do you mean by?
Yeah, okay.
There's all different levels of pollution, right? They could do it a little bit cleaner, a little bit dirtier, and the rights will reflect that, right? The rights are going to be something like, well, you can pollute this much, but you can't pollute this little more than that. So there's all sorts of, it's very flexible. It's not just all or nothing. You can pollute or you can't.
I understand that spectrum in theory exists. I just don't think that in a world governed by who has the most dollars and who has the most demand for certain rights would lead to a spectrum in that regard. Now, when we're talking about pollution, you have to have a broad.
You can't. You just go back to like, well, I don't think. Yeah, you make a good logical argument, but I don't think that'll happen. Blah blah blah. Like, give me an argument.
I didn't say it was a good logical argument. No, that's not what I said. I said I understand how you could say in theory that spectrum would exist, right? But what we have to ask ourselves is, why would the interest of the polluters ever be to be comparatively less advantage than other companies that are able to pollute more, right? This is one. I mean, again, we only fall back into arguments about how pollution as a market, pollution as a force that in theory could be regulated by the market, basically kicks out of all of those arguments, right? No coal company would want to accept the fact that they have to pollute only 20% less than their other coal company, because that means that other coal company is making a hell of a lot more money. They're a lot more competitive, right? So the theory of the
but they save money on the rights. If they're polluting less, they don't have to buy as much. They don't have to pay as much for the right to pollute, and so their electricity is cheaper.
Well, no, because it depends on how expensive it would be to reduce your pollution, right? So,
or it's more. If it's more expensive, then that's a bad deal for the consumers.
If what's more expensive?
If it's more expensive to pollute less, it makes the electricity more expensive for the consumers. Then that's bad, right? The consumers would rather have cheaper electricity and more pollution. So
right, but that's my problem though, is that one consumer base shouldn't have the ability to pollute my air, right? We're all responsible for your pollution, right? And so therefore we ought to have a body that has collective accountability, that has the ability to regulate that type of issue.
But again, you're talking, okay. So I mean,
well, come on. I mean, last year's name. You gotta see. My point is airtight here. Like it's
no, it's not. You keep changing. Like you keep changing what we're talking. So now you're talking about.
No, you're wrong. I haven't changed
different
anything.
consumer.
I reject what
you're
either
saying. Changing things, or you're just not very clear on what the situation is.
Because the situation is so clear. I've given like 100 different.
You argue that rich people, because they're rich, would buy the right to do bad things that would be a net negative for society. And I pointed out to you, rich people.
Not the only reason.
Well, that's one of the arguments you made, and I pointed out, okay, the rich people are rich because they're selling things, and
you're right.
If they get rich, it's because they're they're getting more revenue than it costs, and the revenue's coming from the consumers. So if they get rich, it's probably because they get rich from selling electricity to consumers.
Their products. I agree.
Right. And if they're bidding against consumers for the right to do that anyway, then it seems like it's the consumers in their end who are paying for. You can either pay for the clean air or you can pay for the electricity, and consumers choose what to spend their money on. And
no. But the rights are a secondary market to the products, that are being produced, right? So consumers might decide that they want to directly or indirectly pay for the right to be able to pollute, right? Because, hey, I get cheaper electricity. But then the other side of the coin is that the owners have, like I said, a much more inelastic demand for that, right? So they're pouring even more money into that, much more probably than the consumers can pour in, because they're wealthy sort of, business owners or whatever that are providing a product.
Inelastic demand for the right. Hold on, let me be clear what you're saying.
Relatively inelastic demand for the right, yeah. Like the demand
for the right to
like
pollute.
Someone who owns, like if we imagine the market for the right to pollute, there's a product, the product is the right to pollute the air, right, with emissions, right? And we're talking about different consumer bases for that, right? So for instance, you might have, as a coal company owner, that market, the group of coal company owners, their demand curve for the right to pollute is going to be a lot more inelastic, right? Because they need the right to pollute to make money, right? They have to have that right, or else they're fucking going to go bankrupt, right? And so that curve is going to be different from, like, say, some regular poor person living like down the street. Their demand curve is going to be a lot more elastic because they don't really necessarily care about the right to pollute the air as much as like a rich person, right?
Okay, so
Person who owns a
inelastic in
coal
the sense that
company,
if the price for that right goes up, they'll still buy it. The amount, like,
right. And so what I'm saying is that in terms of the incentives, right? You're saying, it seems like your point is that, well, you have to imagine that the rich people would have like basically think that it was worth bidding up the price to pollute, right? But I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that throughout history we have many examples of
what do you
wealthy
mean bidding
people
up
and wealthy
the price to
corporations.
pollute?
Because what you're saying is it's a competition of dollars. These people have money and they say, hey, we want the right to not, we want to say there's no right to pollute, basically. We want to say you don't have the right to pollute.
Right.
You can't pollute. And then these people say, we want the right to pollute. So ultimately, what the rights enforcement agencies actually end up enforcing is the right that is most valuable, the right that most people are paying for. And my argument is that the most dollars are going to be paying for the right to pollute. Well, there you go.
Okay, but I would argue that they'll end up paying the product will be the right to pollute the optimal amount, right? Since we do agree that there's a spectrum of how much you can pollute, clearly, right? It's not just like you're polluting or you're not. You can pollute a little bit, you can pollute a lot. And there's going to be some optimal level of pollution, like breathing is definitely below, it's part of the optimal amount of pollution.
Companies, obviously, yeah.
So the right to...
That's what I'm saying, though, is that the company isn't going to have... The optimal amount to pollute for the company is the amount that makes them the most money, right?
Yes.
So, like, again, if they're incentivized to basically just produce as much electricity as people can demand, well, there's no like real cap on the amount of pollution. It's basically just like how much does coal pollute, right? Which they don't have control over, obviously, right? It's just burn coal, it pollutes however much it produces, right? And so that's kind of my point, right? Is that I just don't, and you agreed earlier, it seemed like, maybe I misheard, that sometimes the market wouldn't align in this way. And so my only point is that insofar as there's moral hazard in markets and there's, perhaps some utility of standardization, then we should have governments that are able to come in and say, hey, this is now the rule because we've been voted in and this is the rule people want. One vote, one person, one vote is a better way, equitable way to govern ourselves than $1, one proportional effect on the demand for a product, right? I mean, that's kind of my whole point.
Okay, so I think in this particular, I want to separate the idea of, the problem is we're using pollution, which kind of conflates two different issues. There's the issue of like rights enforcement, rights which are where it's easy to know who's violating the rights and who's having the rights violated. And then pollution has the additional problem where like it's sometimes difficult to know that, and the costs are externalized. So let's consider a more straightforward situation, so we consider these issues one at a time. A situation where there's not pollution, but something like some other like more straightforward, right? I'm thinking like theft or something. Yeah, like theft.
Okay.
So, trying to think of a hypothetical where you'd have like some sort of industry that wanted to steal in order to supply their product.
I mean, that could be like, let's just say that you're maybe like slave labor would be let's say that you could go and, enslave people to work for you. And I don't know, maybe that's a better example. I don't know what you're thinking of, but that might be
that might work.
A better example.
Yeah. Okay, sure. So why wouldn't, I mean, do you think you'd have slavery in a stateless society?
Yeah, I would say probably.
Okay, so how would that work exactly? I don't think.
I mean, to be fair, like there's slavery today in a stated society. It's just a matter of like to what degree do we imagine the problem of people being enslaved would be solved by the by the market or the state, obviously. So
yeah, I think we're actually going to end up in a different issue here. But slavery is like, I'd say, extremely unlikely. The thing about slavery is in order to enslave someone, you need to, in a stateless society, you need to imprison them, right? You need to, since you don't have like the government when fugitive slave laws to prevent to actually go and catch your slaves for you and stop them from getting work elsewhere. You actually have to have like, walls and barbed wire and armed guards and everything on your slave plantation, making sure that the slaves actually stay there. and do work, which considerably increases the cost, right, of slavery. In fact, we kind of have an idea of how much that costs because we have prisons which basically have to do that, and I think they spend like $100,000 a year on each prisoner or something crazy like that. So you need to get more than like $100,000 worth of labor out of your slave just to cover that one cost, which seems difficult, especially considering that slaves probably hard to get high quality work out of someone when they're enslaved. But I mean, why would you pay that extra cost? Like, for much less, you can pay someone to just show up to work, and you don't have to have any armed guards or walls or barbed wire.
Why did slave owners in the thousands of years of history decide to use slaves instead of paying people to do their work? I mean, obviously they felt that it was cheaper to house and secure slaves than it was to pay farmhands. Right?
I don't know much about the history of slavery past like thousands of years ago, but I mean in America, the cost of keeping slaves imprisoned was externalized. It was the government, right? Who, like the police, would go and catch your slaves for you for free, or not for free, but the cost would be, it was public money. They would also.
I think that was true. Well, that was true for a time, though. But I believe that that was one of the turning points of the sort of social debate about slavery, was that eventually it became the case where if you were a slave in the South and you could get to the North, you could legally live in the North, right? But even in that circumstance,
but it's still a long journey, right? Like, it's still hard to get. It's much easier to imprison people in a large geographical area. It's because it's difficult for them to escape than it is to imprison them on some private lot, right?
Yeah, but take Virginia. I mean, take Virginia, that was on the border of free and unfree. Obviously, Virginia was an unfree state, and then I believe Maryland then was a free state. I mean, even bordering states, I mean, they chose to have slaves instead of paying people, right? I mean,
yeah, but it's state.
All I'm saying, like, I understand. Understand your point.
So the only reason they could do that is because they could rely on the government to A, catch the slaves if they escaped, and B, prevent anyone else from helping the slaves by giving them a job or by helping them escape, right? That was also illegal. So, and so the government took on that cost. And because they did it on a large scale, they were able to, that's the only reason that you could have a slave plantation that was actually, economically, where you could actually make money off the slaves, because you didn't have to pay for all that security.
But what you're describing is a society that collectivized the cost of slavery because they felt it was beneficial, right, to their economy, to their way of life, right? And so I'm saying that I'm not. The reason I would say like slavery would almost certainly exist in an anarcho-capitalist society is because, of course, we can imagine worlds where societies would come together, form communities, and say, hey, it's we can collectivize the cost of keeping slaves, and we can capture people and enslave them and tell them to do stuff for us, right? And
well,
I mean that's the story of all of human
but you need a
history,
state to do that, right?
And,
they could.
No, why would you need a state? You could just have a community come together and say, like,
you have to make it cost effective to keep slaves. In order to do that, it has to be broadly illegal. You have to do it on a large scale. You have to make it illegal for anyone to help the slave escape or to give them alternative work, right? So like in an anarchist society, if you just have typical slave plantation, a slave just walks off the property and gets a job somewhere, right? And you say,
or the community stops them, right? I mean,
well, why would the community do that? The slave is more valuable as valuable as labor. So some people might want to do that, but why? Some people definitely want to hire the slave to do some other job, right? The slave is valuable. So
right, but why are you assuming that slaves would have free movement? Like that seems like
well, what stops them? That's the question for you.
The community.
What do you mean? Why would the community do that?
I mean, let's say that the community is surrounded around the cultivation of certain crops, right? Like, so let's say that it's a fairly labor-intensive role, like picking, I don't know, for instance, like let's take peppers, for instance, right? Like peppers ripen at different time on the vine, and so you still have to pay. Like, you can't have. There's not like an equivalent of like a corn husker that can come in and just pick all the right peppers, because peppers ripen at different times, so you have to pick them by hand, right? So let's say that your community was exporting peppers, and that was like the industry that your community sort of grew up around and cultivated, I think very rationally you could come to the conclusion, economically speaking, that, hey, it's cheaper for us to just basically capture slaves or enslave certain portions
Who's
of our own
us?
community. The community that's formed around an industry.
No. Why would an individual person in this community want to spend work capturing someone else's slave and returning them back? Why?
Because they feel like it's in their collective interest.
But it's not in their interest. They don't get
Why
anything
not?
for that. Well, what would they get for doing that? What?
They get to live in a wealthier society with the family they grew up in because you're able to.
No, they live in the society either way. Why would one particular person catch one particular escaped slave and return them back? Why would any person ever do that?
Because I don't understand. Because they have a collective interest in their view.
I don't care about collective interest. I care about individual interest because individuals make choices to do things, right?
Okay. But last username. Are you under the assumption that in an anarcho-capitalist society, the notion of collective interest just wouldn't exist?
I don't know what collective interest means.
Okay, your last username. Come on, your community, the people that you live around. You feel like people would have no understanding of community or collective interest in anarcho-capitalist society.
I don't have an understanding. What the fuck does it mean? What is collective interest?
I don't understand. Chat, help me out.
I understand what an individual's interest means. How do you get collective interest from that? What are you talking about?
I'll use an example because I don't know if a definition would work here. Okay, so
are you talking about just the sum of everyone's individual?
Okay, so you understand the example I just gave with the pepper, like the pepper community, right? Like, hey, this is a community that's kind of built around cultivating peppers and selling them, right? Like you understand that, right? So what I'm saying is that let's say that, I lived in a society. Let's say I lived in that community. Let's say it was 500 people that lived in this community. And let's say, let's don't use a slave as an example. Let's say that I saw some 20-year-old kid, they were stomping around in the peppers, just making mischief, being dickheads or whatever. And let's say that I was on my way to work, right? And I saw this happen. I was looking over at the farm, and I saw this 20-year-old kid was being a dickhead and stomping on a bunch of peppers. I might, because I believe in the community, because I'm interested in the community's interest, which is the cultivation of these peppers and being, ensuring that I play my role in that cultivation, although I might provide but an ancillary service to those peppers, or I might be but like a service worker in this economy. I might go over there and say, hey, you dickhead, stop crushing all the peppers. Our society relies on those. And if he keeps doing it, I might try and enact force to get him to stop. Right?
If it's going to cost you something to stop him, which it presumably is if you're using force, and you're not getting any sort of reward for doing this, then no, it's not in his interest to do that. There's no rational reason to stop him.
Okay.
If you believe that...
There is a rational reason to stop him, though.
No, there isn't. If you believe that, then no one has any rational reason to emit carbon. No one has any rational reason to pollute, because it's not in our collective interest to destroy the planet. And so some form of pollution which will do that, no one would ever pollute, because it's not in their collective interest. But we know that's not true. We know that people don't behave that way. We know that if the cost is externalized to the community, then people don't care about it. And that's the problem. People do not act in their collective interest. They act in their individual interest.
They both can and they cannot behave that way, right? I don't think the pollution is a good example to kick. I don't think this is a good example to kick out of the pollution problems, because the whole point of that example is that the costs associated with pollution are external to the people demanding and producing that pollution, and the people who produce that pollution and demand that pollution are able to insulate themselves from that cost. However, an example of someone who's lighting fires in the pepper plantation, as an example, right? That is a cost that is, you're accountable to it directly. Like, say you're a teacher in this town, right? Well, obviously, if you see a kid going and trying to light on fire, I'm using fire as an example versus stomping. If you see a kid trying to light the whole plantation on fire, it is in your interest, though you're a school teacher, to stop him from doing that.
Why?
Because all the kids that go to your school, let's in an ANCAP world where they're paying you to teach them, all the kids that go to your school, their parents work at the plantation, and that's where they get their money to pay you to send their kids to your school, right? So you have an interest.
What is
in
the
stopping that kid.
effect? Okay, just tell me what the effect of this kid stomping on the peppers is on this person who you're expecting to stop them. What actually do they get or not get as a result of this?
What they get by stopping that kid from destroying the plantation, destroying the pepper farm or whatever you'd call it, is they get a society that is able to work on that farm, earn money.
What do you mean they get a
and give it
society?
to them.
What?
Okay.
I don't
Oh my
understand
God.
what you mean.
Last year's name. This is like.
I just stop talking about
last year's name.
societies and collectives.
No,
just tell me what
genuinely.
individual things happen.
No, but okay. Okay. God, I don't want to appeal. I just don't know if I can explain it any better. Chat, maybe give it an example. But like, how do I put this? Like, okay, we can go. Well, fuck, we can go back to the pollution example if you want. But like,
I feel like all of
for
economics teaches you to think about behavior as to think about individual behavior, and any sort of collective behavior only comes as the emergent effect of these individual actions and decisions. That's really what economics is all about, right?
No, that's not necessarily what economics is all about. I just described an example where, like, you as a self-interested person, a teacher in a community that's surrounded, basically a lot of the wealth of that community is based on this pepper farm. They decided, or what do we call it? You decided to open a school there or whatever. You understand, hey, a lot of the wealth of this community is based on this pepper farm. So if this kid over here is destroying the pepper farm, that affects me indirectly. But certainly it affects me, because now all of a sudden the people who actually worked directly at that pepper farm don't have as much money to pay me to teach their kids.
So how much money do they lose? How much money does the teacher lose?
Well, it depends on how much the kid's able to destroy. That's why you have
if
to
the amount of money that the teacher loses is more than the cost of stopping the kid, then they have an incentive to stop them, right?
I don't think so, because I think I don't know if that's true though, because I think we tend to operate to some extent individually based on some sort of like rule utilitarian framework, which is to say that, hey, if this one kid is allowed to like stomp on the peppers, right, to any degree, this might invite other troublemakers to come in and stomp more peppers. So it's important to enforce, societally speaking, the standard that, hey, you don't fucking destroy the peppers, because this is how we make all of our money.
Do you have some kind of model that we can use to predict how this this moralistic motivation will affect people's behavior? How do you weigh that against other incentives they have? Because if you're just saying, well, I think people have some incentive to do the right thing, so do the right thing, that's an argument you can use to defeat any other argument about incentives. Like if you can't boil it down to some numbers that we can compare with each other, then then you can argue anything with that.
Well, yeah, there's a calculus in your mind in terms of the cost of prevention versus the cost.
So let's say there's some dollar value to the feeling you get from stopping the kid just because you think it's the right thing to do. Sure, that's fine. But that is a dollar amount, and if that dollar amount still doesn't make it worth your while, then you won't stop them. Presumably, right? If the cost of stopping them is high enough, you won't do it, no matter how good it feels.
Yeah, I mean, you can trade dollars for like potential damage. Like I was gonna say, like for instance, say that say that 50 people with guns came to your community and decided, hey, we're gonna fucking set fire to this pepper farm. We don't give a shit what you say. Like, okay, well, I as an individual, I'm basically risking everything because they're just going to kill me if I try to stop them. So I'm not going to do that, right? So you have to weigh your not necessarily your literal dollar cost, but you have to weigh sort of the cost either vaguely or directly associated with preventing something from happening, and the cost associated with in the gains potentially with preventing something from happening. Now, my only point is that is a calculation, right? And if your cost to preventing, for example, the young kid stomping on the peppers is very, very low, but the potential implications of allowing him to break that social contract or that rule of, hey, we try to respect the pepper farm in this area is very high, then you're individually incentivized to stop him from doing that.
Okay.
So similarly, if we take it all the way back to the slave example, if you believe, either legitimately based on some economic analysis or just because traditionally that's how it's always been done, that these slaves underpin to some fundamental degree your way of life, then the community as a whole, each individual that makes up that community, is incentivized to form apparatuses and to individually keep those people enslaved. That's my whole point. That's what happened in the South.
Okay. So let me just point out that if I try to make all my arguments for stateless society under the assumption that people put no value on feeling good about things, that people are completely ruthless and amoral, because that seems like the hardest standard that's the conservative assumption, right? I argue that it works even if you assume that. If you want to say that people do put a value just on doing the right thing, on good things happening, that's only going to make it, a stateless society more likely, because now you're saying that people will support just things just because they like it, just because they put a value on that. They're not going to try to pollute. Like, they have an incentive to not pollute just from it feeling bad. They have an incentive to figure out to not pay for rights that they know are wrong. So
but I would never.
In this case, you're saying that a society might allow slavery if everyone in society feels that it's right. Well, that's true. Okay. I don't think there's any system that can force a society to do something that most people in society feel is right and good. Like, well, actually, I do.
It depends on interest rates.
But
that's kind of my point. Though.
But certainly the state doesn't do that. If everyone in society feels like something is right, then the state is definitely going to do it. Okay? Democracy definitely takes the side of the moral majority. No way around that.
Wait, then what was this whole nonsense about how voting has no effect and there's no direct, if you agree with me that democracies do what
the thing that people do get from voting, I would conjecture, is the feeling, the moral feeling from it. That is the thing that they do that is not externalized. You have to actually vote for in a particular way to get the feeling of moral virtue that you voted the right way. And that actually does depend on your individual choice of voting. Who actually wins the election doesn't depend on that, but the feeling you get does. And so I think that is actually what motivates people to vote. But as you pointed out, what people feel is right is not always what's actually right. Sometimes everyone feels that slavery is right, and all it takes is a majority of people to feel that way, and you get slavery, right? That's the problem.
But in your society, it just takes the wealthiest society to pay for the right to enslave people, right?
No.
And I think that's probably. Well, hold on. No. Stop. You can't say no to that. You agreed to that several times.
I didn't. I never agreed to that. You keep saying it, and I keep saying no. Okay, it's not how it works.
You said you didn't, but then I describe it and you agree. So hold on.
It's not just the right to.
Hold on. Just let me ask the question. So if this society, let's take the pollution as an example. If more people were willing to pay for the right to pollute because they had more dollars, they're putting more money behind the right to pollute.
Let's stick to slavery. I'm not done with slavery yet. Before we get to pollution, okay?
Oh, okay. Let's use slavery.
To get the right to enslave people. Let
me ask the question. If more people put more dollars behind having the right to enslave people than people put dollars behind preventing others from having the right to enslave people, then the right to enslave people,
the right to not be enslaved.
Around.
It's the right to not be enslaved yourself. That's like your right.
Okay, so let's say that there were
and when you
more
pay
dollars behind
the right cost, part of the cost of the right to enslave people is the cost of enforcing that right? Because you have to. The rights enforcement agency has costs.
Why are you avoiding my question? What? The question is because you keep saying this isn't how your society would work, and then I describe a situation, you end up agreeing. So agree or disagree. Let's say you said the right isn't to enslave people, the right is to not be enslaved. So let's say that
those are the two rights that are competing.
Well, yeah, the right to enslave versus the right not to enslave. Let's say that there's more people who put more money behind their rights enforcement agency that says they have the right to enslave people than there are people who put money behind their rights enforcement agency who says that they have the right not to be enslaved. There's more money on the enslavers than the people who don't want to be enslaved. So in your society, and if that's the case, then the right to enslave people would be around. Is that not the case?
If that was somehow true, then sure, but it's not.
Okay, well then stop saying. Well, don't say that when I say the most money behind the rights are the rights that you end up getting is wrong, because for the third or fourth time now you've agreed. Well, that is actually how it would work, right? I mean, that is how your society would work.
But so you say the amount that you put up, you have to pay for the enslavement too, right? Because part of the right to enslave people is the actual cost of enslaving them. So if you want the right to enslave people, you're paying the rights enforcement agency to actually make sure to imprison them, to keep them on the property and to make them work, and so they don't escape. And as we already pointed out, the cost of that is extremely expensive. So
It can be, sure.
So the question is, why are people paying that much money to enslave someone instead of just paying people to work for them, right?
Right, but you're making an empirical. You're making.
You
an
get slavery if
not a
it's
moral
cheaper to
case.
enslave someone than to hire them. I conjecture that there's no reason to expect that it would ever be cheaper to enslave someone than to hire them. Because to enslave someone, you have to hire someone to enslave them.
Okay, we've had more and less robustly stated societies, but in most of human history, we've had slavery in those societies, right? It's a fairly contemporary thing in the grand scale of human.
Well, as I say, the only society in which slavery that I'm familiar with that had slavery and where I not know how it works is America. And in America, the answer to that was to externalize the cost of enforcing the slavery using the government, right? Okay, I don't know how prior societies that didn't do that, if there were any, did it.
Yeah,
maybe,
let's just move beyond that to some extent, right? But let's just say that what you said, right, which I feel like you've agreed with, is that it is true that in your society, the most dollars behind the right would be the right that gets elected, right? So, if more dollars are behind one right than another in their competing rights.
You keep saying that. It's not what it is. No, listen. Stop. You listen. No. You're wrong. You keep misquoting me. That's not it.
The fourth time, though.
What happens is the right that's the most efficient, right? Because it's the cost of the right, and the people who pay for the right are paying for it because it makes them money somehow, because it's valuable to them. So it's the right that makes the most profit for people, right? The right that has the lowest cost and generates the most value for the least cost, right?
I get that. No, I get that. Okay. But all you're saying, I get that. You're making, and this is what I said before, you're making an empirical assumption, not necessarily a moral case, right? And why I say that is because what I'm saying is true. What I'm saying is definitively true in your system. The people who put the most money behind a certain right are going to get that right because the price is bid up. They've decided it's worth it. Now, what you're saying is, well, hold on.
No, it's the right. No, you're wrong. It's the right that makes the rights enforcement agencies the most profit. That's what.
Practically speaking, well, obviously, because that's true, but that's just transitive. The demand curve of the right and the money behind the right, obviously, right? But what you're saying,
but that's not going to be the most the right with the highest cost. It's not the right with the highest cost. It's the most profitable rights. Right, so people could pay a lot of money for some right, but if it costs a lot to enforce that right, it's not making the rights enforcement agencies a lot of profit, so they're not going to do it. They're going to go with some cheaper right that people are paying less for, but if the cost is low enough, they're going to make more profit doing that.
Right, it's dependent on the demand curve of the people who want the right, and like you said, in some part, the input cost of enforcing that right. I'm agreeing with you, right? All that I'm saying, though, is that there's an amount of money where a rights enforcement agency would say, we will enforce your right to own slaves. That's all I'm saying, right? You have to agree to that because otherwise it makes no sense what you're saying. It would be inconsistent. Now, all that I'm saying is that if we take the issue of slavery, there would be people who would own slaves and the right enforcement agency would enforce that right. You're saying empirically that's unlikely, or like not empirically, but
I'm saying those people would be throwing their money away.
Well, and so I suppose the last point that I can make in that regard is that if it was true,
and that's the best you can do, right? In any system.
No, hold on. If it was true that hold on, I suppose in all of human history, it has been true that you can always pay someone to do work for you, or you can enslave someone. That's always been true, except for contemporary history, where most countries have, I suppose all countries, slavery is illegal. Now, however, in most of history, when these two markets were competing, right, the cost of enforcing, basically enslaving someone, and the market for, regular old people, paying them to do the work for you, you're saying that at least in the society that you're familiar with, America, when we had slavery, the cost of slavery was collectivized. Now, ignore the fact that that's not really true, right? A lot of costs were internalized. You had to feed them and house them yourself. You're just saying, keeping them on the plantation, basically.
No, but it is part. Right? It wasn't entirely externalized, but it was mostly externalized. It was a huge part of it. Yeah,
the cost. Well, sure. The cost of keeping them, if they escaped, basically, is what we're talking about, right?
Right.
What I'm saying is that we could run the perfect experiment in this regard. We had a North and a South United States, right? And in the places that bordered free states, they still chose overwhelmingly to enslave the black population. But that's only using the U.S. as an example.
What does
slavery
that
has been a
prove?
what I'm saying is that if you run that experiment, it appears that they chose, even when the cost of escaping was relatively low, or the cost of enforcing it was relatively low, and the cost, the potential profits associated with their labor was relatively low or high, just depending on what they sold, I suppose, they still chose to enslave the people. Right?
Individual people had slaves because they could do it cheaply, because the state was paying for it. This is true even on states that bordered other states that didn't have slavery. It's still a big state.
No, because other states, okay, yes, it's a big state in the sense that some, depending on where you lived in the state. I'm just saying that if you ran that experiment out, you would find that they still chose to have slaves working their farm otherwise. But if we use other examples, not just the U.S., slavery has been a function of human society except for the last 150 years or so, right? And so,
well, okay, so how did that work?
Choose to pay people. How did it work? What do you mean? You enslave someone for one reason or another?
Has there been a society that had slaves without collectivizing the cost of enforcing it?
I guess it depends on what you mean by collectivizing it. Like, I would argue that in like Roman society, right? Obviously they had a state, the Roman state, but certainly in Roman times, the depth of reach of the state was much smaller than it is today.
But were you allowed? Was a slave allowed to go and get a job somewhere else?
Well, I mean, presumably yes. I mean, they could always escape and go work illegally somewhere.
So you're telling me if a slave escaped their master, then it was only the master who like no one else had any obligation to help the master get their slave back. Slave could go get a job somewhere else. Someone could hire them. The state did not get involved in any way in helping that person get their slave back.
Well, if you're like a Roman plantation owner, what do you call the cops? I mean,
I don't know.
No, you have to form like a society.
I don't know how Rome worked, but I assume they had some sort of legal system, right?
No, of course they did. All I'm saying though is that when it comes to the cost, it's a lot harder to collectivize a cost in a ancient society, right? Because we don't have like, it's hard to call someone instantly and then tell them to drive to your location
all you need to do is make it impossible for the slave to live any other way. So maybe they could escape, but if they couldn't buy a place to live or whatever, or get a job or whatever it is you do in Rome in order to survive, if they weren't allowed to do that because other people weren't allowed to help them do that, then that would force them back to being a slave because it's the only way they're allowed to live. But again, that's because you have a society that actually enforces that rule.
Well, that's okay, but that's kind of my whole point. It's just that you could have societies that would enforce that rule in an anarcho-capitalist society. However, the society we live in today,
but there's an economic incentive for people to change that rule. If you somehow ended up with a society like that,
there's literally always been an economic incentive not to enslave people. It's the competing costs that we've been talking about, right?
True.
And so when we're talking about society, the rule today in society, for instance, I know for a fact that states will enforce the rule of not having slaves because, pretty much every state in the whole world has made slavery illegal, right? Now, there are different states that are more broken than others and less able to enforce their rules, but that's not a function of their rules about slavery. That's more of a function of their sort of central government in general, right? But, basically the developed states with good governing, good governing economies, I should say, good governing sort of institutions, they've been able to outlaw slavery and enforce that rule. So I know states can work in this regard, right? All that I'm saying is that I am uncomfortable with the precarious nature of an anarcho-capitalist society where you can bid up the potential cost of that right and pay for it, make it profitable to enforce your right to own a slave, or perhaps in a more practical case, make it certainly profitable to enforce your right to pollute. And
you haven't explained how you would do that though, with the slaves. Like I don't understand how it would be profitable to pay. Why is it more profitable to pay for the right to enslave someone than it is to just pay them to do whatever you want them to just hire them as an employee, right?
Okay, so because in an abstract sense, it's because the returns associated with the slave's production are higher in your case, than the cost of enforcing that right, right? And so
Are
it
they?
seems like in many societies,
Why?
well, it seems like in many societies, they've decided that the costs associated with enforcing the ability to enslave people is lower than the returns associated with that slave's production or the slave population's production. So I don't think that calculus is unreasonable of me to assume it could happen again in an anarcho-capitalist society with no state enforcement of anything.
I'm just trying to imagine how it would work. You have some plantation. Assuming you're not going to pay, if you're saying you don't have to pay the cost of having your own security guards and walls and like run it like a prison, we've already agreed that's going to be way too expensive. So you have some plantation in which physically the slaves could just walk off at any point. Well, it's not? I mean, you think it's going to be cost effective to actually have like a literal prison where you keep the slaves? And
my point is that it could be cost effective. That's my only point, right? Is that
how?
There's because you might have
you're
a high margin enough.
You're competing with the other factories that don't have to have like a maximum security prison at their factory. They just
you're also competing with the other factories that have to actually pay their workers, right? So I'm not saying costs associated with slavery.
I think it's cheaper to pay a worker than it is to imprison them. You still have to feed them and house them, right? So you're paying for that all yourself. You have to, you have to pay. Plus, you have to pay the security to stop them from going where they want to go, and you get lower quality work because they're kind of pissed off at you. And you also have to pay. You're also, I mean, keep in mind, anyone can come along, and if they can't walk off themselves, someone else can offer, hey, I'll break you out of here, and just pay me when you free and you start making more money. You can just pay me. I'll send you the bill. Be a great business emancipating slaves for money, right?
Well, and
if the slave's more valuable outside of the factory, that's going to be a lucrative market because there's money you're creating value by emancipating the slaves because they're going to be better workers to make more money. So
so the last thing that I'll say in this regard is that I've never said that there are no costs associated with slave ownership. Obviously, there are. You have to feed and house and provide subsistence and enforce your ability to keep them. Obviously, that's true, right? I don't think I would ever make the case that there couldn't be a society which made the cost of slave ownership higher than the cost of paying people. We live in that society today because of regulation, right? State regulation. The cost of owning a slave is way higher than the cost of just paying someone to do work for you.
I don't think you need regulation for that. I think it's just inherently higher. It's inherently more expensive.
Right, and the only thing that I was going to say, right, was that if it was inherently more expensive, then societies in aggregate, whether they be stated or not, would determine we don't need to use slaves. The market would still work in that regard, but the market doesn't work in that regard. The market has determined in the past, for most of human history, that enslaving people is profitable.
No, right? But you haven't given an example of where there was of a situation where you had slavery where it wasn't enforced somehow by a state. It wasn't collectivized.
The state of Virginia under the state of Virginia in the Confederate States, that is a society. You would agree?
A society, sure, it's a society.
The state of Virginia. Okay. You would also agree that they had slavery, right?
I believe so. Yeah.
Right. So that is a society that determined that the costs associated with enslaving black people was worth the profits associated with those black people's labor when they were enslaved. You would agree with that?
No. What do you mean the society determined? The society didn't determine anything. They had a government which allowed slavery and taxed people to pay for the cost of enforcing slavery. So everyone was collectively paying for that cost. And people who had slaves got free enforcement of their slavery, right?
That society determined that cost was worth it.
No, they didn't.
That's my point.
What do you mean nobody determined anything?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, the state of Virginia was a democracy for all the non-slaves, right? I mean, excluding women, obviously. Basically the men, the class of people who could vote, they decided that it's worth it to have slaves.
When you say determined, what does that mean?
That means that the society determined. Now you're
mean they voted
taking
for
an issue with the fact that they voted for a government that allowed slavery.
They did that.
Right.
By saying that
they determined that the cost of slavery was less than the profits associated with the labor of slavery.
But that's just fantasy.
Because
you're just describing something that didn't happen. What does it mean determined? Who determined what? You think every voter did that some sort of calculation and then decided to vote that way?
I think I mean you might think it sounds absurd, but I do think that people make calculations in their head when they vote. They prioritize things when they vote.
I think
and
that's an absurd
what the
conjecture
people of
that
Virginia,
that the voters, every voter did some sort of calculation, as if anybody even knew how to do that calculation.
Okay,
We don't even know how to do that calculation now. We're arguing about it. And you're saying that
voters
they
in
all somehow
Virginia-
correctly calculated that it was in some...
Okay.
What?
if voters in Virginia were being made poorer year after year, we're losing money. We're being made poorer. All of us are losing money on this. We're fucked because we have slavery. We're enslaving people, and because that's less efficient, we're being made poorer and poorer. We have less jobs available to us because we're not getting hired. Instead, they're using slave labor. If collectively we're being made poorer because of slavery, do you think that they would vote to keep it year after year? Or do you think they'd vote to get rid of it?
People vote for things that make them collectively poorer all the time. So that's not hard to believe.
I don't think. Okay, I just feel
So
like
yeah, absolutely. They were absolutely voting for something that was, morals aside, was economically destructive for sure. I think slavery
economically destructive for some people, obviously.
Well,
but because
the total social value. If you just measure the total social value, I think you produce more value without slavery than with, for any given society.
I totally agree.
And I think the people voted for it anyway. Well, then they didn't determine that, did they? They were obviously wrong.
No, they were correct because they weren't the ones bearing the substantial cost of slavery. The slaves were the ones bearing that cost. Oftentimes when you look at studies, right? Because if you look at the economists that study like black markets and slave economies, what they'll find is that slavery is wealth destructive, right? And a lot of libertarians and people would use, slavery is not, you don't need as much regulation because slavery is, as a market, is inefficient, right? Because it's wealth destroying. But it's mostly wealth destroying for the enslaved people. That's how you get that result. But if you exclude the wealth destruction of the enslaved people and you only include the wealth creation of the slaves and basically understand that the wealth destruction is mostly on the back of the slaves, then for the slave owners, wealth is being created by the slaves, right? And so for everyone in Virginia who wasn't, let me finish. For everyone in Virginia who wasn't a slave, they determined that collectivizing to some extent the costs of slavery and allowing the rule of slavery to continue was profitable for them.
Okay, so let's say you're correct that if you disregard the utility of the slaves, the value to the slaves, then the value of people who were not enslaved was greater by having slaves, and that's why those people who were allowed to vote voted to have slavery. Okay, sure. Let's suppose that could be true. So therefore what?
Right. So the only reason I pointed that out as an example was because you seemed to have a problem with almost inherently the notion of collective interest or societal interest. So my point is that in an anarcho-capitalist society without a broadly accountable democratic state, right, that you would have most likely societies that determined that it's cost effective for them to enslave people and to use that labor to produce goods or services in order to enrich themselves because they're earning the dividends from the slave labor. Sure, the slave gets housing and food.
Well,
and
first of all, you have that. You have that in a democratic society, as you very detailed pointed out, right? If you have democratic society, they can. You're the one saying that democracy people will vote to maximize their value. So if it maximizes their value to enslave people, then they'll do it, and they did.
Yeah.
Now I'm saying I don't think what I like about an ANCAP society is that it's not democratic and it doesn't work that way.
My position, those two positions are totally compatible. What I just said.
What two positions?
Like the position that democratic government sort of stated societies can do bad things, sure, right? But I can also still believe in having a state and having a democracy. Those are compatible opinions. Correct? I mean, you would agree that the market could do bad things, but also believe in anarcho-capitalism, right?
Sure. So, but I assume you're trying to make the argument that slavery is more likely in an anarchist society than in a state society.
That is my argument.
Okay, so why is that?
So I think it is the case because when we're talking about compartmentalizing people's, I suppose the laws that they have to live by, right, the rights that they're purchasing, right, which is
Compartmentalized?
kind of what we're
How?
talking.
What does that mean?
Well, you're sort of perfectly, well, not perfectly because you're not going to get exactly what you want, but like you're more, the rights that people have are more fitted, right, in an anarcho-capitalist society in theory, right? So what you might argue is that in a stated society, you have to pay for a bunch of shit you don't want to pay for because of the taxes that you get collected from you. You have to follow a bunch of rules that you don't think are right because of the, people across the country that are voting for those, for those kind of policies or whatever it is, right? But in an anarcho-capitalist society, those rules are a lot more fitted to the individual because we have competing books of laws basically that people are following, right?
Sure.
So that's what I mean by compartmentalization, right? So when you're further compartmentalizing the rights that people have, right? If we imagine a society, and it doesn't have to be a particularly big society, but if we figure that a society could exist, which have existed in all of human history, is my argument, where they've determined that it's more profitable for them to enslave people than to basically pay just regular workers to do the work for them, then they will do it. And they'll very immediately be able to do it because they can just pay for that right.
But as you've pointed out, it's only more profitable if you ignore the value of the slaves. Now, in an anarchist society, there's no reason that the value to the slaves would be ignored. I mean, because the slaves could, it at least provides more opportunity than with the state for the slaves to go and actually get their own rights enforcement, right? Slave can go hire a rights enforcement agent. Well, why not?
As you're saying, how? Okay, you're a slave. You have no money. How are you going to pay a rights enforcement agency to?
You have value. You have labor value.
So you would have. So instead of being enslaved by the people enslaving you, you'd have to promise your labor value in the future to the rights enforcement agency. That sounds like slavery anyway.
It's a debt.
So you have to. Okay, but now you're saying that the way that you would have to escape slavery is immediately by going into a pretty significant amount of debt. We went from slavery to indentured servitude.
Well, it's going to be worthwhile for you, right?
Well, I agree that most people would be willing to pay quite a high personal cost in order to not be enslaved, but that's kind of my point.
The reason
I feel like
the reason you would get this loan is
like
because the person emancipating you expects you to create more value once you're emancipated, and you can go make money and pay off your debt. So it's going to be good for you and them, right?
But my point is that your right to not be enslaved, that is a right that should be collectivized. Right, the cost associated with enforcing the rules.
Be. As you pointed out, in a democratic society, if there's a majority that wants to enslave a minority, they can just vote to do it. The government does it, and there's just no possibility for these slaves to go. And no one can start a business emancipating slaves. The government will stop them. No one can hire slaves. The government will stop them. In a stateless society, there's at least the possibility that someone could start a business hiring slaves or emancipating slaves or helping out the slaves and provide alternatives. And there's more possibility that could actually get a foothold, right? Not saying it's guaranteed, but it seems, by comparing the two systems, it seems like you're better off in an anarchist society. There's more opportunity for that slavery to end. Because individual slaves, because there's no government stopping anyone from even, some enterprising individual from creating a market for emancipating slaves.
Yeah, if I lived in the early 1800s, I think that this argument would hold a little bit more water, right? Because we're working within the mindset of the time. However, we're not living in the 1800s, right? And I think that in general, what's tended to be the arc of, people's interaction with democratic governments has been to vote for policies that tend to enable the most positive freedom over time, right? And that's sort of necessarily precludes the ability to enslave other people. And so, in my view, history is on my side.
If you're gonna rely on people's good nature to prevent slavery, then why are you disregarding that in an anarchist society too? I mean, why would they enslave people? Why would they pay? Why wouldn't they?
Because in our current society, there are people in our current society that would love to enslave other people for many sort of reasons. But
as you pointed out, most of us don't want to, and we don't want to see other people be enslaved. It's a pretty strong sentiment against it. Like, you were the one arguing if a society wants to enslave people and they have democracy, then they will, as you pointed out.
Right, exactly. So I'm not disagreeing with that. All that I'm saying is that in a world where, say 3% of people are, let's say that it's because they're racist, right? They would capture as many black people as they wanted and enslave them, right? Um, that's in this current society, well, they have no recourse, right? I mean, in theory, they could vote for pro-slavery politicians, but that's such an unpopular position that nobody would run on that platform. However, if we're talking about a society where basically it's just the dollars that make the difference, not the aggregate opinion, right? Well, those 3 million people are going to have a lot of dollars, right? And so
Not more than
there's
than all the people who don't want slavery. Those other people have dollars too. Why are you assuming this tiny minority of people has generally more people, more money, right? In general,
there's competing rights enforcement agencies.
So
I mean, you might just buy. Well, couldn't you just not buy, but you could. Apologies. In a world where 3-4 million people want to enslave other people, that's a 3-4 million person market for a rights enforcement agency.
What's the total population?
That right.
3-4 million out of what?
In the United States, it's 330 million.
Right.
But
so there's going to be a lot more money. Chasing no slavery than chasing slavery, right?
No, I mean that's your assumption.
A much bigger market for not slavery than slavery. You said 4 million out of 300 million want slavery. The rest don't.
No. Right. So there's a bigger market of people who don't want to be enslaved than people who want to enslave. But for those 3 or 4 million people that want to enslave, again, it might just be worth it for them to pay for that right. I mean, that's my whole point.
No, it's not.
Time.
What do you mean they can't?
We're looping last year's name. We can't do it again.
You're just saying ridiculous stuff. You're just saying, what if you're saying there's a tiny minority of people that want something terrible, and for some reason they have tons and tons of money, even though this thing is extremely destructive and expensive and pointless. How do they have all this money?
Imagine it. Last year's name. Imagine it. Imagine a society where the people with the most money want to do terrible things with it. It's an unimaginable society.
How do you get money, Econoboi? You get money by creating value.
Well, you might just be, but after getting the money, you might have
then you might suddenly turn evil and decide to be destructive. I guess that could happen, but the best we can, in general, you would expect. Oh my God.
Last year's name. That's not even that's not a crazy proposition though, is the idea that you might accumulate a lot of wealth and then all of a sudden determine, hey, this society is run by dollars. Now I've got a shitload of dollars. Well, now I can much more actively do what I want, right? I mean, look.
But then you'll lose your dollars.
Slavery example. Well, no, because there's not. Why would you lose?
You make money by creating value. You lose money by destroying value. I mean, if the costs are not externalized, you're just destroying your own money.
Well, yeah, but you might just have some sort of weird preferences, right? I mean, we talked about pollution earlier today, where you don't make money by throwing trash in a river, but you might. For whatever reason, you might have a preference to maintain that right. Now, slavery is an interesting example. I'm not saying that...
Because there's no externality to slavery, right?
Really quick, though, I'm not saying that... I don't know if slavery would be like an incredibly widespread problem in an anarcho-capitalist society. That's impossible to say. But I do think relative to our society today...
But, okay.
No, I don't think so, right? Because, again, we had more and less problems with slavery over time, and it seems to be dependent on government regulation. But I would just say that comparing the society that we live in today versus a society transition to an anarcho-capitalist society, I think we'd have more slavery in that society than we have today. That's the only sort of proposition that I'm trying to defend here. And so insofar as you can point to problems in the past of democracy and slavery, I totally agree with those problems. But it appears you wouldn't agree that people were ever collectively incentivized to enforce, either within the state or without the state, the institution of slavery, which I completely disagree with. It seems like almost in your mind there'd be no slavery at all in your sort of anarcho-capitalist society. But that's
no. I think an anarchist society is the best system for preventing slavery, for avoiding it. I was saying anything's possible. I'd say anything is impossible in an anarchist society. Never argue that something is impossible or bad things can never happen or all problems will be solved. All I'm saying is that this society an anarchist society seems like it would be better at dealing with pretty much all problems than a state. That's it. Not that it's perfect, not that it fixes everything or prevents all terrible things from happening, but it just seems better. I just don't see how a state has any advantage. I don't see how there's anything what a state could do that you can't do any other way. That's what I've never, like, I don't understand. Some people just think about the state like it just has this magic power to fix things. Like, what is it that makes the state so special? What is it?
Well, no, I mean, it doesn't have magic powers. It has collective powers, right? That's kind of what I would talk about.
But collective, any description of collective power that I've heard doesn't sound like a good thing. It seems like a problem. The collective power seems like it creates these massive externalities through democracy. All the things that people complain about in markets when you have market failure is like democracy is one gigantic market failure. It's a system where no one has any incentive to vote wisely. The only incentive they seem to have when they're voting is to vote for something that makes them feel good. And there's just no reason to think that the vote that makes you feel good is the vote that's actually going to be, economically optimal for society.
Well, there's two things though, is that, and this is the last thing that I'll say, we've been going for a while here, but the last thing I'll say is that there's no reason to believe that, number one, the dollars that people spend towards things would be more collective, more like socially conscious in nature, let's say. I think votes are definitely more socially conscious in nature, in my view. And then, with regard to what you said at the very end there, is that people don't vote for like the most economically efficient outcome. I would agree, but we don't always want the most economically efficient outcome. That's kind of my point, right? Is that, it might be like most.
Well, no, I think I think by definition, we want the most economically efficient outcome. When I say economically efficient, I mean like the thing that we want the most. Right?
Well,
what else would that mean?
Well, you would. I think you mean to say like the most sort of economically efficient implies like market clearing and stuff. If you were to say, I think you mean to say like a economically
what
rational,
we want means anything. It seems like the economically most optimal for society is the good a definition for that as any. I can't think of any other definition. Right?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, obviously I don't agree. I feel like we've kind of hit rock bottom here. I guess at the end of the day, what I think is that I don't think that a purely market-governed society with I suppose money chasing after different rights is a society which would deal with more efficiently with what I would view as maybe the most significant problems of society, which would be things like pollution and criminal enforcement, let's say, things like that. And it sounds like you basically just view the opposite, and I certainly don't agree. I think that the crux of the debate, what I would summarize this debate is the discussion on pollution, where you said that obviously if there's more people willing to pay for more dollars for the rights to pollute, then obviously there is a social good in that pollution happening. But I would just disagree with that. I don't think that just because more money is poured into a certain right, that makes it better. Now, similarly, just because more people vote for a certain thing doesn't make it necessarily better. We're talking probabilistically and on averages, and certainly probabilistically and on average, I would say a stated society governed by democracy is a better society than one that is governed by basically markets and who has the most money. But what's your last words? I'll give you the last.
My last word.
The last words on it
is that if I'm ignoring all the sort of weird ideology and mythology around democracy, if you look at how it actually works, certainly anyone who understands economics or thinks economically would have to admit that the only incentive that an individual has to vote in a particular way is the way that vote makes them feel, or maybe the way it impresses their friends or something. Certainly not that they have any incentive to vote based on the thing they're voting for actually happening, since their individual vote has effectively no effect on whether that whether that person will win the election or not. So and everybody knows that, so that cannot be what actually influences their decision, right? Incentives matter when it's actually an incentive, when your choice actually determines what you get. That's essential for an incentive to actually work. And vote, that's not true with voting, except when it comes to just sort of feelings. And the idea that if people are just voting based on what makes them feel good, the idea that what makes them feel good will also happen to be economically efficient in these extremely complicated markets that are very difficult to understand, these difficult problems, difficult industries. The idea that people's like feeling good will somehow converge onto good solutions to those problems is just a complete leap of faith. I don't think any rational person can justify a belief like that. It's just crossing your fingers. At least with a stateless society, with markets, you have some sort of mechanism, some sort of rational mechanism for improving things, for people actually being paying the cost and receiving the rewards of the individual choices they make. It's not perfect. You still have externalities. You still have market failures. But I don't think you can improve on market failures with democracy, which is one gigantic market failure. It's the worst possible market failure. You can't just add another market failure into the process to make it go away. It doesn't work that way. So I don't see, it just seems like we'd be better off without a state. I just don't see any reason that we need it. That's it.
Okay. There we go. Well,
Good talk. That was a long one.
Where can people find you, last username?
You can find me on my channel.
Where can they find your pro-market propaganda?
Here we go. I don't.
Oh yeah, just link your stuff in the chat if you want.
Yeah, I'll just link my channel. I don't have a pretty URL yet, but my channel is called Econarchy. There it is.
Oh, you're not like a Twitch person? I thought you were on Twitch.
I have a Twitch channel too. It's last_username, but I don't think I'm gonna start streaming on YouTube now. I think I'm done with Twitch. Twitch is so done
yesterday. With Twitch.
Yeah.
The market of last username has decided Twitch is no longer worth the hassle.
Yeah.
That's fair.
It wasn't growing on Twitch.
It's always good. It's always good talking. Last username, I enjoy talking to you and anarchists in general.
Do you really?
And yeah, I always have a fun time. I mean, I think that anarchy is as a broad philosophical point of view, is certainly it's not a philosophical point of view that you don't run. You can run into like right wingers and socialists and stuff day to day, and that's not the most unusual thing. But anarchists anarchists in real life, that's certainly I've yet to meet an anarchist in real life, so I think it's rare enough, but it's also very
yeah, me neither.
Anarchism is a very rare philosophy for people to have in real life, but it has a lot of depth in terms of its philosophical underpinnings, and I think that that's pretty interesting. So yes, to answer the question, I do enjoy talking to you and any anarchist. Well, not any. I'm sure there's anarchists I wouldn't like, but you get what I'm saying, though. It's always good talking.
Likewise, my friend. Take care.
All right. I'll talk to you later. See ya.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, hope you guys enjoyed that. It was pretty long. First time I streamed on YouTube, but I'm going to try doing this now. It's going to be my new home. Twitch, yeah, everyone was banned from Twitch. I wasn't banned, but I'm kind of tired of it. I'm going to see what happens on YouTube, see if I can grow any better than I was on Twitch. Yeah, that was pretty long. 3 hours or something. I wanted to get a moderator, but we didn't have time to do it because I wanted someone to kind of stop us, sort of like intervene, and like if we were looping, and like force us to stay on topic and to engage with each other, but whatever, didn't happen. Okay. What do we got? 3 viewers. Not bad. Better than 0 viewers. I think that's what I had for my first Twitch stream. So YouTube is already doing better. Last user, we need to ask, why are we ignoring property rights in this debate? Well, I make economic arguments. I'm just more interested in making economic arguments because I think they are, first of all, I don't believe in morality at all. I'm not even kidding. I just don't believe in it. I can probably do a whole stream about that. But also, even if I did, I'd still make economic arguments because I think the economic arguments are more unique. You don't hear them very often. You hear lots of moral arguments for anarchy, but the economic arguments are less common. So I want to get those out there. And I think also the economic arguments are more compelling to people who are sort of on the left, the progressives, because they think sort of more in terms of utilitarianism and justify the means, that kind of thing. So I'll make those kind of arguments to them, especially if they happen to be economists like Econoboi. So that's why we didn't talk about property rights, at least in moral terms. I could talk about property rights in economic terms. That's kind of an interesting discussion. But we didn't have time to talk about everything. Bouncing between 2 and 5. Oh, viewers, yeah. Well, remember to hit the like button. I guess that will help me get more viewers on the next stream, maybe. I don't know how the algorithm works, but I assume it's something like that. Just scrolling back through chat. Slavery might have been profitable when worker productivity was low. Now it's more profitable to just tax them. I see what you did there. All right. Well, I gotta get for work in the morning, so I'm gonna wrap things up. But hopefully, this is the start of a new arc of streaming for me. And thanks for coming out. Can I raid? I don't think I can raid. I think I need to unlock that or something. If I do, I'm not going to spend like 10 minutes being a boomer trying to figure out how to do it. So no raid. I guess I'll just say goodbye. Thanks for coming out, guys. Stay free. I think next time, I heard this, I listened to Dave Smith's podcast, and he did this response to David Friedman, who wrote an article where he mentioned him about immigration. It's the old open borders thing. Is some libertarians are for open borders, which would be me. Some are against it. And I thought I would weigh in on that. Maybe I'll react to his video. I'll react to his reaction next time to give my thoughts on the topic, because it's an interesting debate. Okay? Anyway, have a good night and stay free.